In this episode, we are going to explore 13 separate accounts of people who found themselves in the middle of a nightmare that looked like a normal life. These cases are all connected by a specific kind of hidden danger that hides right in front of us in the middle of a crowded city or a quiet suburb. We have added background sound to these stories to help you relax while you listen and focus on the details of each case. If you find this kind of storytelling valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel so you do not make a mistake and miss our future uploads. I would also love to hear from you in the comments regarding where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. The truth is that the people who live closest to a threat are usually the ones who see it far too late. They assume a strange smell or an odd sound has a simple, boring explanation, because that is how a normal day is supposed to work. But sometimes, the explanation is something that will haunt a city for decades and change the way neighbors look at one another. We often think we know the people living behind the door next to ours. But these stories prove that some people are very good at keeping a secret. It is July 17, 1975, in the St. Pauli district of Hamburg, West Germany. Firefighters are rushing up the narrow stairs of a tenement building on Zeissstrasse, responding to a report of thick smoke coming from a fourth-floor window. They expect to find a kitchen accident or a mattress fire, but the air in the hallway stops them before they even reach the door. It is filled with the overwhelming chemical scent of thousands of pine-shaped air fresheners. Behind the plastic scent of the forest, something much heavier is waiting for them in the dark attic. What exactly was the man in apartment 4 trying to preserve under all those layers of green plastic? If you are enjoying the atmosphere of these stories, please consider inviting the like button over for a cold drink in your apartment this evening. Just be careful not to ask about the strange humming coming from behind the wallpaper or the way the air fresheners seem to be moving on their own. It tends to make for a very short and very quiet conversation before the sun goes down. Ruth Schultz is walking through the cold rain of a Tuesday evening in November, 1974. She is 52 years old, and her feet are heavy with the fatigue of a long shift cleaning office buildings in central Hamburg. The neon lights of the St. Pauli district reflect off the wet pavement in blurred streaks of red and yellow. She pulls her coat tighter against the wind and heads toward a familiar basement bar where she knows the drinks are cheap and the rooms are warm. The bar is called the Golden Glove, and it is a place where the air is always thick with tobacco and the price of schnapps never changes. Ruth finds her usual spot near the end of the counter, away from the loud music and the younger crowds. She enjoys the anonymity of the dim lighting and the predictable rhythm of the bartender's movements. It is a sanctuary for people who do not want to be seen or questioned about the lives they lead during the day. The room smells of stale beer and damp wool, a scent that Ruth has come to associate with comfort and safety. She lives under the constant pressure of a low wage and the creeping isolation of being a middle-aged woman living alone in a busy city. She has a near-future expectation of retiring in a few years. But for now, she just wants a drink to numb the ache in her back. She keeps a small, worn photograph of her mother in her purse, a detail that makes her feel less like a stranger in the crowd. She has a habit of stirring her drink exactly 3 times with a plastic straw before taking the first sip. It is a small, quiet ritual that helps her transition from the stress of the office to the calm of the evening. She watches the door, noting the people who enter and exit, but she never makes eye contact with anyone for more than a second. Ruth is a woman who prefers to listen to the world rather than speak to it. A man sitting 2 stools away turns toward her and offers a small, crooked smile. He is short and has a heavy, distorted nose that looks like it was broken and never properly set. He is wearing a faded brown coat and holds a glass of gin with hands that are covered in the calluses of a laborer. He introduces himself as Fritz, and his voice is soft, stuttering, and strangely gentle for a man of his appearance. Fritz tells her that he works as a manual laborer and that he has lived in the district for several years. He seems lonely in a way that Ruth recognizes, a quiet desperation that he tries to hide behind talk of his record collection. He offers to buy her a second drink and suggests they head back to his place to escape the rain. Ruth looks at his scarred face and decides that he is far too small and nervous to be a threat. They walk together through the narrow streets of St. Tyne, Pauli, their shoulders brushing as they navigate the puddles on the sidewalk. Fritz leads her toward an old tenement building on Zijstrasse that looks like it hasn't been painted since before the war. The hallway is dimly lit and the wallpaper is peeling away in long, damp strips that look like skin. Ruth follows him up the stairs, her breath hitching slightly as they reach the 4th floor. As they stand in front of his door, Ruth notices a sudden and sharp change in the air. It is a powerful, chemical scent of artificial pine that is so concentrated it makes her eyes water. It is the smell of 1,000 car fresheners all opened at the exact same time in a small space. She asks Fritz why his floor smells like a plastic forest in the middle of the city. Fritz chuckles and tells her that the building has very old plumbing and the landlord is too cheap to fix the pipes. He says he uses the air fresheners to keep the neighbors from complaining about the stagnant water in the basement. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a heavy ring of keys, fumbling with the lock for several seconds. The door finally swings open, and he motions for her to enter the apartment. The room is small and crowded with stacks of old newspapers and piles of discarded clothing. There are green, tree-shaped air fresheners hanging from every available surface, including the light fixtures and the curtain rods. They sway slightly in the draft from the hallway, looking like a strange and macabre decoration. The smell is nearly unbearable now, a sickly sweet layer over a thick and heavy rot that Ruth can feel on her tongue. Fritz goes into the small kitchen to pour more drinks, leaving Ruth to sit on a worn velvet sofa. She notices a small wooden door near the corner of the room that leads into the crawl space under the eaves of the roof. There is a heavy padlock on the latch, and the wood around the frame is stained with a dark, oily substance. She feels a sudden surge of unease as she realizes the air fresheners are most numerous around that specific door. Fritz returns with the glasses, and his demeanor has shifted completely in the few minutes he was away. The stutter is gone, and his eyes have taken on a flat, cold quality that reminds Ruth of a shark. He sits down next to her and places a heavy hand on her knee, his grip far stronger than she expected. He tells her that he is tired of being ignored by women, and that tonight, she is going to stay as long as he wants. Ruth tries to laugh it off, suggesting that it is late and she really needs to get home to sleep before her shift. She starts to stand up, but Fritz grabs her hair and pulls her back down onto the sofa with a violent jerk. He tells her that he has a secret in the attic and that he wants to show her what happens to people who try to leave him. The ordinary logic of a friendly drink has been replaced by a mechanical, focused terror. The immersion of the moment traps Ruth in the small, pine-scented room. She can feel the rough, abrasive fabric of the sofa against the back of her legs and the biting pressure of his fingers on her scalp. The pressure of the silence in the apartment is like a weight, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the air fresheners hitting the wall. She thinks to herself that the neon lights outside the window look like they belong to a different world entirely. Fritz stands up and walks toward the front door, sliding a heavy iron deadbolt into place. He puts the key into his pocket and turns back to her with a smile that does not reach his eyes. He tells her that no one can hear her through the thick walls of the tenement and that the neighbors are used to the sounds of his television. Ruth realizes she is functionally alone with a man who has prepared for this moment for a long time. For the next several hours, Ruth is subjected to the shifting and unpredictable moods of a man who seems to be fighting a war in his own head. He weeps about his mother and then screams at Ruth for things she has never done. He keeps pointing toward the padlocked door in the corner, telling her that his friends are resting in there. He says the pine trees keep them happy and quiet so they do not bother the other tenants. Ruth survives the night by making herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She listens to his rambling stories and nods when he demands her attention, playing the role of the companion he is so desperate to have. When the sun begins to rise, Fritz finally collapses into a heavy sleep, the empty gin bottle rolling across the floor. Ruth finds the keys in his coat pocket and lets herself out of the apartment without making a sound. She never goes to the police because she is a woman who is used to the harsh realities of the district. She assumes he was just a violent drunk, and she is too ashamed to explain why she went home with a stranger. She changes her route to work and never steps foot in the Golden Glove again. She does not know that she is one of the only women to ever leave that attic alive during those years. The secret of apartment 4 remains hidden for another 8 months as the smell in the hallway continues to grow. The neighbors complain to the landlord, but Fritz always has an excuse about the plumbing or his hoarding habits. He buys more air fresheners by the box, pinning them to the walls until the green trees cover nearly every inch of the wallpaper. No one wants to force their way into the home of a lonely, broken man. On July 17, 1975, a fire breaks out in the apartment directly below Fritz. The heat is intense, causing the floorboards of the 4th floor to warp and the drywall to crack open. Fireman Peter Jansen enters the apartment to check for survivors and finds himself in a room that looks like a plastic forest. He sees the thousands of air fresheners melting in the heat, their chemical scent mixing with the smoke of the fire. As he clears away a pile of charred newspapers near the corner, he spots a large wooden box tucked into the crawl space. The padlock has melted away, allowing the door to swing open a few inches. Janssen looks inside and sees a human hand protruding from a stack of garbage. He realizes with a jolt of horror that the hand is mummified, preserved by the dry air of the attic and the chemicals from the fresheners. The police recovery operation reveals a scene that shocks the entire city of Hamburg. Behind the walls and under the piles of trash, they find the dismembered remains of 4 different women. Fritz Honka had been killing marginalized women from the local bars and keeping their body parts in his home for years. He had lived, slept, and eaten in the same room where his victims were stored like pieces of unwanted furniture. The investigation proves that Fritz targeted women like Ruth, people he believed no one would miss or look for. He used the air fresheners to mask the scent of his crimes, creating a sensory barrier that kept the truth at bay. The trial in 1976 reveals the cold and calculated nature of his violence. The court finds him guilty and sentences him to life in a psychiatric hospital where he can no longer hurt the lonely souls of street. Paris. Fritz Honka remained in custody until his death in 1998, never fully explaining why he chose to live in a cemetery of his own making. The building on Zeitstrasse was eventually torn down, but the story of the attic remains a dark part of the city's history. Ruth Schultz never spoke about her night in the apartment, but she could never stand the smell of pine again. It was a scent that meant a forest to most, but to her, it meant a room with no exit. The attic was finally silent, but across the ocean, a different kind of message was being painted in red paint. In the suburbs of South Africa, a rising politician was about to learn that some codes are written in blood rather than ink. The silence of a suburban kitchen can be just as dangerous as a dark alley in Hamburg. It is 6:15 on the evening of November 22, 1977. In the quiet suburb of Springs, South Africa, Jean Cora Smit is standing in her kitchen, carefully peeling potatoes over a white porcelain sink. She is a woman who values order and routine, especially on a night when her husband is expected home for a celebratory dinner. The house they are renting is large and modern, with bright white cabinets and a view of the manicured lawn through the window. Jeannie Cora is the wife of Robert Smit, a brilliant economist and a rising star in the National Party. Robert has just returned from a high-profile post at the International Monetary Fund in Washington and is now running for a seat in Parliament. The phone has been ringing all day with calls from supporters and journalists. There is a sense of momentum in their lives that feels both exciting and exhausting. She moves from the sink to the stove, checking the temperature of the oven. The house is silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of a bird in the garden. Jeannie Cora enjoys these quiet moments before the whirlwind of political life takes over for the evening. She adjusts the lace collar of her dress and looks at the clock on the wall. Robert is usually punctual, but his schedule has been unpredictable lately. He has been spending long hours in private meetings, some of which seem to weigh on him more than others. He mentioned a discovery he made regarding government funds, something that sounded serious, but that he promised to explain later. Jeannie Cora does not worry about the details of his work, but she makes sure the home remains a sanctuary for him. She has a habit of setting the table exactly 30 minutes before he arrives, placing the silver-polished cutlery on linen napkins. She knows that Robert appreciates the consistency of their home life after a day of complex financial negotiations. It is a small, precise routine that she has maintained across 3 different continents. Tonight, she has even placed a small vase of fresh yellow flowers in the center of the table. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across the kitchen floor. Jeannie Cora walks to the back door to check if the evening air has cooled down enough to open a window. She hears the sound of a car engine idling somewhere nearby. It is a low, steady thrum that does not quite match the sound of Robert's vehicle. She pauses with her hand on the brass door handle, listening to the rhythm of the engine. The sound persists for several minutes, neither approaching nor fading away. It is a small, unexplained detail that feels slightly out of place in the predictable quiet of the neighborhood. She tells herself it is likely just a neighbor returning home or a delivery driver checking a map. She turns back to the stove, but the feeling of unease does not disappear. The kitchen, which felt bright and open a few minutes ago, now seems strangely vulnerable with its large glass windows. She decides to close the curtains earlier than usual. As she reaches for the drawstring, she notices a flash of movement near the side of the garage. It is just a shadow, a tall figure moving with a speed and silence that suggests intent. Jeannie Cora freezes, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She realizes that the back door is unlocked, and the kitchen light makes her a perfect target for anyone standing in the darkness of the yard. The ordinary logic of a suburban evening is starting to fail. The low thrum of the car engine suddenly cuts out, leaving the house in a vacuum of total silence. Jeannie Cora stares at the back door, waiting for a knock that she knows is not coming. She thinks about the heavy telephone in the hallway, but it feels a mile away. The air in the kitchen feels thick and metallic, smelling of the gas from the stove and the cold dampness of the evening grass. The immersion of the moment hits her with the force of a physical blow. The fluorescent light above the sink flickers, casting a harsh, clinical glare on the white cabinets. The pressure of the silence is like a weight on her chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. She thinks to herself that Robert was right to be afraid of the things he found in those files. The back door does not creak when it opens. It simply swings inward, admitting 2 men who move with the synchronized grace of professional soldiers. They are wearing dark clothing, and their faces are obscured by the shadows of their hoods. Jeannie Cora does not have time to scream before the first man is across the room. She is forced down onto the kitchen floor, her cheek pressed against the cold linoleum. She can see the legs of the kitchen table and the fallen yellow flowers from the vase. The men do not speak to her or ask for money. They operate with a terrifying clinical detachment, as if they are completing a task on an assembly line. One man stands guard at the window while the other produces a small, silenced firearm. The shots are no louder than the sound of a heavy book hitting the floor. Jeannie Cora is gone before the second man pulls a long, thin stiletto knife from a sheath on his belt. He works with a focused rage, striking 14 times long after the life has left the room. They wait in the darkened house for nearly an hour, sitting in the shadows of the foyer. When Robert Smith finally pulls into the driveway and walks through the front door, he is ambushed before he can even set down his briefcase. He is shot multiple times at close range, falling onto the rug he and Jeannie Cora had chosen together in Washington. The killers do not flee immediately. They spend several minutes in the kitchen, moving with a calm that suggests they are not worried about being caught. One of them produces a can of red spray paint from a bag. He walks to the white kitchen cabinets, the ones Jeannie Cora had been admiring just an hour before. With steady hands, he sprays 4 large letters across the cabinet doors. Irau. Then, on the cabinet next to it, he sprays 3 more. T.M. The red paint is bright and wet, dripping down the white wood like fresh blood. They leave the house through the back door, disappearing into the night without taking a single piece of jewelry or a cent of cash. The following morning, the Smith's driver, a man named Daniel, arrives to pick Robert up for a campaign event. He finds the front door standing slightly ajar. When he steps inside, the smell of copper and spray paint is the first thing he notices. He finds Robert in the foyer and Jeannie Cora in the kitchen. And then he sees the message on the wall. The South African police launch a massive investigation, but they are met with a wall of silence from the very beginning. Ballistics reports confirm that 2 different calibers of weapons were used, proving there were at least 2 shooters. But no shell casings are found at the scene, and no fingerprints are recovered from the spray paint can or the furniture. The mystery of the message RAUTEM becomes a national obsession. Some investigators believe it is a cryptic code used by a shadowy intelligence unit. Others suggest it is an acronym for a phrase in a different language, a signature left by a hit team to claim credit for the execution. The letters remain a terrifying cipher that no one can fully break. The lead investigator, a man who has seen hundreds of crime scenes, publicly states that he has never seen a hit this clean. There were no witnesses in a neighborhood where the houses are only 20 feet apart. No one heard a car, a struggle, or a shot. It is as if the killers and the Smiths simply vanished into a different dimension for 1 hour. Rumors begin to circulate that Robert Smith had discovered a massive financial scandal involving government slush funds. The theory is that he was planning to go public with the information after the election. The hit was not a robbery, but a state-sanctioned erasure designed to protect the people at the very top of the power structure. The case of the Smith murders remains officially unsolved to this day. The tall assassins, as the rumored hit team came to be known, were never identified or brought to justice. The files are still open in the archives, but the trail has been cold for nearly 50 years. The house in Springs was eventually cleaned and rented out to a new family who knew nothing of its history. They repainted the kitchen cabinets, covering the red letters with a fresh coat of white. But the story of what happened on that Tuesday night persists in the dark corners of South African history. Robert and Jean Cora Smith were buried in a quiet ceremony, attended by the very people who may have ordered their deaths. The flowers on their graves have long since withered away. All that remains is the memory of a quiet evening that was interrupted by a message in red paint. It is a humid Saturday night in October, 1975, in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria. Akin is standing in the lobby of the Glover Memorial Hall, holding a small bag of salted popcorn and a glass bottle of cold soda. The air is thick with the scent of roasted kernels and the heavy, floral perfume of the crowd. He is 22 years old and has been looking forward to this screening of a new American thriller for weeks. He moves with the crowd toward the velvet curtains that lead into the main theater. The room is cavernous, with high ceilings and rows of red-cushioned seats that have seen better days. Akin finds his way to the very front row, where the screen looms large and bright above him. He likes being close to the action, where the light of the film washes over his face and makes the rest of the world disappear. The theater is packed to capacity, with every seat filled and people leaning against the side walls. Akin settles into his seat and looks to his left and right. There are 5 other people in his row, all strangers to him, but all sharing the same expectant energy. A young couple is whispering on his left, and a group of 3 students is laughing softly on his right. The lights dim, and the screen comes to life with the flickering images of the newsreel before the main feature. The sound system is surprisingly loud, vibrating the floorboards beneath Akin's feet. He can feel the rumble of the bass in his chest, a rhythmic thumping that feels like a second heartbeat. He takes a handful of popcorn and waits for the story to begin. The film is a heist movie, filled with car chases and dramatic confrontations in the streets of New York City. The characters on screen are constantly shouting and firing weapons at one another. Akin is mesmerized by the choreography of the violence and the way the music swells during the tense moments. He does not notice the temperature in the room rising as hundreds of people breathe in the enclosed space. Halfway through the movie, Akin notices a slight discomfort in his right foot. He realizes that the laces on his heavy leather boot have come undone and are trailing on the sticky floor. He ignores it for a moment, not wanting to miss the pivotal scene unfolding on the screen. The protagonist is currently trapped in a warehouse, surrounded by men with submachine guns. He looks down at his boot and then back at the screen, weighing the risk of missing a few seconds of the plot. The sound in the theater is a chaotic wall of noise, with explosions and gunfire echoing off the concrete walls. Aiken decides that he cannot walk out of the theater with a loose lace without tripping on the stairs. He takes a deep breath and prepares to lean down into the darkness at his feet. As he begins to bend forward, he hears a strange, sharp sound that does not quite belong to the movie. It is a dry, metallic click that happens at the exact same moment a character on screen fires a revolver. It is so perfectly timed that Aiken almost convinces himself it was just a glitch in the theater's speakers. He pauses for a split second, his head halfway to his knees. He finishes the movement and reaches down to grasp the frayed laces in his hands. The air near the floor is cooler and smells faintly of damp concrete and old dust. He can no longer see the screen, only the dim blue light reflecting off the floorboards. The movie continues to roar above him, a symphony of shouting and screeching tires that masks everything else. The smell of hot popcorn is suddenly overtaken by a sharp, acrid scent that reminds him of a spent match. The pressure of the crowded room feels different now, as if the air around his row has suddenly become thinner and colder. He thinks to himself that the man sitting next to him has stopped breathing entirely. He pulls the laces tight and begins to tie the first loop of the knot. Above him, the movie reaches a crescendo of violence as a dozen men open fire at once on the screen. The sound is deafening, a continuous barrage of white noise that shakes the very frame of the building. Aiken works quickly, his fingers moving by touch, alone in the pitch-black space under the seats. He stands up and settles back into his seat, smoothing out his shirt and exhaling a sigh of relief. He looks toward the screen, expecting to see the young couple to his left, still leaning toward each other. Instead, he sees that the woman is slumped forward, with her head resting on the back of the seat in front of her. Her boyfriend is leaning back with his mouth open, as if he has fallen into a sudden and deep sleep. Aiken feels a chill crawl up his spine that has nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looks to his right at the three students who had been laughing earlier in the evening. They are all sitting in the same strange project, frozen positions, their eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the screen. None of them are moving, and none of them are reacting to the loud climax of the movie. Aiken reaches out a hand to tap the shoulder of the student closest to him. His fingers brush against the back of the man's neck, and he immediately pulls his hand away. The skin is warm, but there is a wetness there that feels thick and slippery. Aiken looks at his hand in the flickering light of the projector and sees that his palm is covered in dark red. He stands up and tries to shout, but his voice is swallowed by the final explosion on the screen. The credits begin to roll in silence as the music fades into a low, mournful cello piece. Aiken looks around the theater and sees that the rest of the audience is beginning to stand and stretch. They are chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the carnage in the very first row. The house lights flicker on, flooding the room with a harsh glow that hurts Aiken's eyes. The people in the second and third rows begin to push past him to reach the aisles. One woman glances down at the front row and lets out a scream that cuts through the chatter like a knife. Within seconds, the theater transforms from a place of entertainment into a scene of pure chaos. Aiken sits on the floor in the middle of the aisle, staring at his hands. The police arrive at the Glover Memorial Hall 20 minutes later to find the theater cordoned off. 5 people in the front row are dead, each of them killed by a single shot to the back of the head. There are no shell casings on the floor, and no one reported seeing a weapon. The projectionist is brought down from his booth to speak with the lead inspector. He tells the police that he saw a shadow move near the screen during the final act of the film. He assumed it was just a patron going to the restroom and did not give it a second thought. The investigation quickly hits a wall of impossible facts that the police cannot reconcile. Over 300 people were in the theater, yet not a single one reported hearing a gunshot. The seats in the second row were occupied by a group of off-duty soldiers who were trained to recognize firearms. They insisted that the only noise they heard was the audio from the movie. Forensic experts examine the bodies and find that the wounds are incredibly precise. Each shot was placed at the base of the skull, suggesting a killer with professional training. The lack of shell casings indicates that the shooter used a revolver or carefully collected the evidence. They also discover that the weapons were fired from a distance of only a few inches. The police begin to look for a connection between the 6 victims in the front row. They find that the victims were completely unrelated to one another in any way. One was a teacher, 2 were students, and the couple was planning their wedding for the following spring. The mystery only deepens when the police realize the victims were not seated in their ticketed spots. They had moved to the front row during the previews because the theater was crowded. This means the killer could not have known who would be sitting there. A reconstruction of the timeline reveals the terrifying truth of the massacre. The killer did not hide in the shadows or wait for the theater to empty. They walked along the narrow space between the front row and the screen while the movie played. They used the flickering light and the booming sound as a physical shield to hide their movements. The twist in the case comes when a ballistics expert realizes the timing of the shots was not random. Every single murder occurred during a scene in the movie where a character on screen was also firing a weapon. The killer had watched the film enough times to memorize the exact frames where the sound was loudest. They used the heist on the screen to provide the cover. This level of planning suggests a perpetrator with a background in military intelligence or professional crime. They were not looking for a specific person, but were performing a demonstration of skill and power. They wanted to prove they could kill 5 people in a crowded room without being noticed. The front row was chosen simply because it was the easiest place to operate. No one was ever arrested for the cinema floor massacre. The police followed hundreds of leads, but the killer left behind no physical evidence and no motive. The city of Lagos was gripped by a fear that lasted for years. People refused to sit in the front rows of any public space, fearing the shadow behind the screen. The Glover Memorial Hall eventually stopped showing movies and was converted into a community center. The red cushioned seats were removed and replaced with folding metal chairs. But the people who remember the night in 1975 still look at the front with dread. They know that the darkness of a cinema is never as empty as it seems. Aiken moved away from Lagos a few months after the investigation ended. He never went to see another movie in a theater for the rest of his life. He told his family that he could still hear the sound of the metallic click whenever a room got too quiet. He spent his days working in the sun, away from flickering lights and shadows. The final report on the massacre sits in a dusty box in a police archive. The names of the victims are listed in neat rows, a testament to a night that ended far too early. The killer remains a ghost, a shadow that moved through a room and left only a mystery. There is a small plaque near the entrance of the building today. It mentions a tragedy that occurred during a simpler time in the city's history. But for those who were there, the tragedy was anything but simple. It was a moment where the fiction on the screen and the reality of the front row became one. The sound of a movie gunshot is designed to be thrilling and safe. But on that night in Lagos, the sound carried a weight that no one was prepared for. It was the last thing 5 people ever heard before the world went dark. The popcorn bag Aiken held was found on the floor, half filled with salted kernels. It sat there for days in the empty theater, a reminder of an ordinary life interrupted. The cleaning crew eventually swept it away, but the scent of gunpowder seemed to linger in the curtains. The case remains a chilling example of a predator using the environment to their advantage. It serves as a reminder that we are often most vulnerable when we are most distracted. The people were looking at a light on a wall, never realizing the danger. The survivor still checks his boots every morning to make sure the laces are tied. He does it in the light, where he can see his hands and the floor. He never lets himself be caught in the dark again. And he never sits in the front row. He knows that the difference between life and death is a few seconds spent leaning down. The victims were buried in different parts of the city, their families left without answers. They found no comfort in the police reports or the passage of time. The cinema floor massacre remains a wound in the history of Lagos that never quite healed. The killer walked out of the theater with the rest of the crowd that night. They likely complained about the heat or the quality of the acting like everyone else. They disappeared into the bustling streets and were never seen or heard from again. They left behind a row of empty seats and a story that no one wanted to believe. The final image from the scene was a single shoe left under a seat. It was a small, delicate pump that had slipped off in the moment of the impact. It sat there in the yellow light, a physical echo of a night that was supposed to be fun. It was the only thing in the room that was still waiting for the movie to start. But the credits had already rolled for everyone in that row. It is a heavy thing to realize that a place of safety can become a trap in seconds. The flickering light of a screen provides a perfect cover for the darkness that lives inside people. But as we move from the crowded theaters of Lagos to the quiet canals of California, we find a different mystery. A simple object left in the water can hold a secret for 50 years. It is a crisp morning in March, 1976, along the Whiskey Slough in Stockton, California. Ray is standing in the bow of a small, flat-bottomed boat, scanning the muddy banks of the irrigation canal. He is 42 years old and has spent most of his weekends looking for discarded scrap metal along the waterways of the San Joaquin Delta. His partner is at the motor, navigating the slow current with a practiced hand. Ray enjoys the quiet rhythm of the morning, the way the fog clings to the tule reeds and the smell of damp earth that rises from the banks. He watches a red-winged blackbird balance on a swaying stalk of grass near the water's edge. This part of the canal is remote, surrounded by miles of flat farmland that seems to stretch on forever. Ray is looking for anything made of copper, brass, or heavy steel that he can haul back to the scrapyard for a few dollars. He has a routine of checking the eddies and the bends in the canal where the current naturally deposits floating debris. Most of what they find is harmless junk like rusted barrels, old tires, or tangled fishing nets. Ray takes pride in his ability to spot a valuable piece of metal from 50 yards away through the morning haze. He adjusts his heavy canvas gloves and signals for his partner to slow the boat down as they approach a wide bend in the slough. Ray notices a large, rectangular white object bobbing near a cluster of downed willow branches. At first, he thinks it is a piece of styrofoam or a discarded cooler that a fisherman left behind. But as the boat gets closer, the shape becomes unmistakable. It is a 1950s-style refrigerator, the kind with the heavy latch and the rounded corners. He finds it strange that the appliance is floating so high in the water, as if it is almost completely empty. Usually, a refrigerator of that age is a solid block of steel that would sink to the bottom of the slough in seconds. Ray points toward the white box and tells his partner to bring the boat alongside. He thinks they might have found a high-quality piece of insulation or perhaps a hidden stash of copper tubing inside the motor housing. As the side of the boat bumps against the rusted metal of the refrigerator, Ray notices a detail that makes him pause. The door of the unit is not just latched, but is wrapped multiple times with heavy silver duct tape. A large, weathered padlock is secured through a makeshift bracket on the side. This is not a piece of trash that was simply dumped into the water by a lazy homeowner. Ray reaches out and places his gloved hand on the cold, wet surface of the door. The metal feels thin and vibrated slightly with the movement of the water beneath them. He can hear the sound of the small waves lapping against the hull and the distant, lonely cry of a crow in the fields. The pressure of the moment settles over him as he realizes that someone went to a great deal of trouble to keep this box closed. He thinks to himself that whatever is inside was never meant to be seen by anyone again. He grabs a heavy steel crowbar from the floor of the boat and wedges the tip under the silver tape. The adhesive makes a loud, rhythmic tearing sound that seems to echo across the flat water. Ray works quickly, his breath visible in the chilly morning air as he peels back the layers of tape. The padlock is rusted, but the mechanism is still strong. Ray has to use the full weight of his body to lever the crowbar against the bracket until the metal finally snaps with a sharp, metallic crack. He tosses the broken lock into the bottom of the boat and takes a step back. He waits for a second, half expecting something to push back against the door from the inside. Ray reaches forward and pulls the heavy handle of the refrigerator. The rubber seal makes a wet, sucking sound as it breaks away from the frame. A wave of stagnant, cold air hits him in the face. smelling of damp wool and something sickly sweet that he cannot identify. The interior of the fridge is packed tightly with a faded blue and white quilt. The immersion of the scene locks Ray into the small space of the boat. He can feel the grit of the metal floor through the soles of his boots and the biting cold of the spring water on his splashing hands. The silence of the delta feels like a physical weight, pressing in on him from the vast, empty fields. He thinks that the man who owned this refrigerator must have had a very quiet life before he decided to bring it here. He uses the tip of the crowbar to snag a corner of the quilt and pull it toward the opening. As the fabric shifts, Ray sees a human foot wearing a white sock. He drops the crowbar and tells his partner to head back to the dock immediately. They leave the white box floating in the reeds and do not look back until they reach the nearest telephone. The San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office arrives 2 hours later to recover the refrigerator. They tow the unit to the morgue in Stockton, where investigators begin a meticulous reconstruction of the crime. When they fully remove the quilt, they find the body of a young woman in her early 20s. She is dressed in a high-quality t-shirt with the word Maranatha printed across the front in stylized letters. The most striking detail of the discovery is not the victim, but the way she was prepared for the water. Her limbs are bound together in a tight, fetal position using several lengths of heavy nylon rope. The knots used to secure the rope are not the simple overhand knots of a casual amateur. They are professional-grade clove hitches and bowlines, the kind of work done by someone who spends their life on a ship. The lead investigator calls in a local knot expert to examine the bindings. The expert confirms that the knots were tied with extreme precision and tightened in a way that suggests the killer was used to securing heavy cargo in rough seas. This piece of evidence changes the entire direction of the case. They are no longer looking for a local farmer, but for someone with significant maritime experience. The investigation into the Maranatha t-shirt leads the police to a religious commune that was active in the Pacific Northwest. They find that the shirt was a limited run given to members of the group during a retreat in 1975. But when they check the missing persons reports for the commune, they find no matches for the woman in the refrigerator. She remains a Jane Doe. Her face reconstructed by forensic artists and shared with police departments across the country. For the next 4 decades, the case of the lady in the refrigerator remains one of the most famous mysteries in California. Investigators revisit the file every few years, looking for a new lead or a missed detail. They examine the silver tape, the padlock, and the specific brand of quilt found inside the unit. But without a name for the victim, the search for the killer is a journey into a void. The voice of the investigation turns colder and more clinical as the years pass. They focus on the physical logistics of moving a loaded refrigerator from a vehicle to the water. The unit was heavy enough that it would have required at least 2 people or a very strong man with a specialized hand truck. They search the records of all local trucking and shipping companies for employees with a history of violence. The breakthrough does not come from a witness or a confession, but from a small sample of hair preserved in the freezer unit. In 2022, forensic genealogists use modern DNA technology to build a profile of the victim. They begin to trace her lineage through public databases, looking for distant cousins or siblings. The search leads them across the country to a family in Tennessee. In 2023, the woman in the refrigerator finally receives her name. She is Jewel Parchman Langford, a 48-year-old businesswoman who had vanished in 1975. She had traveled to Montreal to visit a friend and was never seen alive again. The discovery shocks the investigators, as Jewel was significantly older than the initial forensic estimates suggested. The realization that she was a successful business owner from Tennessee changes the meaning of the Maranatha shirt. It was not a sign of her belonging to a commune, but likely a garment she had picked up during her travels. The focus shifts to her final contacts in Montreal and the people who would have had access to a vehicle capable of hauling her body across the border. The final verdict on the case is still being written by the authorities in Canada and the United States. Jewel's family was finally able to bring her home and give her a proper burial in her hometown. The mystery of who tied those professional maritime knots and padlocked the door remains an active murder investigation. The killers are believed to be men who are now in their late 70s or early 80s. Jewel Langford lived a full life as a sister and an entrepreneur before she was erased by a stranger. The blue and white quilt was returned to her family as a piece of property, a heavy reminder of the long years she spent in the dark. The refrigerator was destroyed decades ago, its steel recycled into something new and unremarkable. The irrigation canal in Stockton still flows through the delta, past the willow branches and the red-winged blackbirds. The water is clear and cold, showing nothing of what it held for those few hours in 1976. The only thing left of the crime is a small, rusted padlock sitting in an evidence locker. It is still locked, holding on to a secret that was never supposed to be told. It is 10:15 on a Tuesday night in November, 1976. In the city of Aalst, Belgium, Jan is walking through the city park, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the damp cobblestone path. He is 44 years old and has just finished a long shift at the local brewery, where the smell of fermented hops still clings to his heavy wool coat. The park is a shortcut he has taken 1,000 times, a dark green vein running through the center of the quiet town. Jan enjoys the way the fog rolls off the Dender River, wrapping around the trunks of the ancient oak trees. He passes a row of empty green benches that look like skeletal ribs in the moonlight. This time of year, the park is usually deserted, save for the occasional stray cat or a late-night cyclist. Jan is focused on the warm glow of the street lamps at the far exit, thinking about the bowl of soup his wife left on the stove for him. He moves with a steady, tired pace, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to escape the biting autumn chill. He has a routine of counting his steps between the lamp posts, a small mental game he plays to pass the time on the long walk home. He knows it takes exactly 64 steps to reach the stone bridge and another 80 to reach the park gates. The air is crisp and carries the faint, metallic scent of the nearby train tracks. Jan lives under the constant pressure of providing for his 3 young daughters during a difficult economic stretch for the brewery. He is a man who notices the small details, like the way the rust is beginning to eat at the iron railings of the bridge. He has a plan to fix the leaking roof of his house before the first heavy snow of December arrives. He is a reliable man, the kind of person who never misses a day of work and always carries an extra umbrella in his bag. The park is silent tonight, with even the wind dying down to a faint whisper in the high branches. Jan crosses the stone bridge and begins the second half of his walk toward the city center. He adjusts his scarf and looks at the dark silhouette of the park gazebo. The shadows there are long and deep, stretching across the path like spilled ink. He feels a small surge of gratitude for the simple safety of his predictable life in Aalst. He is exactly halfway between the bridge and the gate when he hears a sound that makes him stop mid-step. It is a sharp, rhythmic snip of metal against metal, coming from the darkness behind a cluster of manicured hedges. It sounds like a gardener trimming a rose bush, but the timing is completely wrong for such a chore. Jan looks toward the sound, but he sees nothing but the shifting gray mist and the black outlines of the trees. Jan tells himself that it must be the night watchman, or perhaps a branch clicking against a metal sign in the breeze. He starts walking again, but he increases his pace, his eyes darting toward the thickets on either side of the path. The sound of the snips follows him, keeping perfect time with his own footsteps. It is a physical, mechanical noise that does not belong in the natural silence of a sleeping park. He reaches the next lamp post and pauses in the circle of yellow light, turning his head to look back the way he came. A figure steps out from behind a large oak tree, standing perfectly still about 50 yards away. The person is wearing a long, dark coat and a pale white mask that reflects the dim light of the moon. They are holding a small, leather satchel in one hand and a pair of silver surgical scissors in the other. Jan feels a cold wave of adrenaline wash over him as the ordinary logic of the night disappears. He realizes that the figure is not a watchman or a neighbor, but a predator who has been waiting in the dark. The park exit feels like it is moving further away with every second he stands still. He turns and begins to run, his breath coming in ragged, white gasps that burn his lungs. The immersion of the moment traps Jan in the narrow space of the path. He can feel the jarring impact of the cobblestones through the thin soles of his shoes and the stinging slap of wet leaves against his face. The pressure of the silence is replaced by the roaring sound of his own pulse in his ears, a frantic drumbeat that drowns out the world. He thinks to himself that no one will ever find the small silver watch he promised to give his daughter for her birthday. He does not make it to the gate. The figure moves with a terrifying, fluid efficiency, cutting across the grass to intercept him near the final row of benches. Jan trips on a patch of black ice and falls hard against the frozen ground. He looks up to see the white mask hovering over him, and the last thing he hears is the rhythmic snip of the scissors. The body of Jan is found the following morning by a woman walking her dog. She initially thinks he is a mannequin left as a prank because there is so little blood on his clothes. When the police arrive, they find a scene that defies every criminal profile they have on file. Jan has been killed with a single, precise incision to the neck. But that was only the beginning of the work. Dr. van de Vijver, the lead medical examiner, is called to the park to perform an on-site assessment. He discovers that several of Jan's internal organs, including his heart, have been removed with surgical precision. The cuts are so clean and anatomically correct that they could only have been made by someone with professional medical training. There are no jagged edges, no signs of struggle, and no unnecessary damage to the surrounding tissue. The investigation into the Aalst butcher reveals a series of similar murders across the region over the past year. In each case, the victim was targeted in a public park and dissected in the dark with incredible speed. The killer seems to have an intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the skill to operate under extreme pressure. The lack of blood at the scene suggests that the killer may even be using specialized clamps to keep the work clean. The police begin to monitor the local hospitals and veterinary clinics, looking for a doctor or a butcher who has been acting strangely. They interview hundreds of medical students and surgical assistants, but every lead turns into a dead end. The killer leaves no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses who can provide a clear description of a face. The white mask becomes the only detail that the town of Aalst can hold on to. The voice of the community turns from concern to total paranoia as the sun begins to set each evening. The city park, once a place of pride for the residents, becomes a forbidden zone after 6 o'clock. People lock their doors and pull their curtains tight, listening for the sound of scissors in the street. The mystery of the missing hearts becomes a dark legend that haunts the Belgian countryside. The twist in the case comes when Dr. van de Vijver notices a pattern in the discarded remains of the victims. He realizes that the organs were not just removed, but were taken in a specific order that mimics a complex surgical procedure. The killer was not just murdering people. They were practicing a craft in the most horrific way possible. The park was not a hunting ground, but a literal outdoor operating theater. The climax of the investigation occurs when a night watchman claims to have seen a man in a surgeon's gown walking through the woods behind the brewery. The police launch a massive dragnet, searching every abandoned building and cellar in the district. They find a hidden room in the basement of an old medical supply warehouse. Inside, they find a collection of preserved organs and a set of silver scissors resting on a velvet cloth. However, the room is empty, and the lease for the warehouse was signed using a name that does not exist in any government record. The trail goes cold as the person responsible for the room vanishes into the fog of the river. The murders in Aalst stop as suddenly as they had begun, leaving the police with a collection of trophies and no one to charge for the crimes. Jan was buried in the local cemetery, his family left with a void that no investigation could fill. The brewery held a moment of silence for him, but his seat at the bar remained empty for years. The city of Aalst slowly returned to its routine, but the shadow of the butcher never truly lifted from the park. The iron railings on the bridge were never fixed, and they continue to rust in the damp air. Today, the city park is bright and filled with families during the day, but the benches near the gazebo are still avoided after dark. The files on the Aalst butcher are kept in a locked cabinet in the police archives, labeled as a permanent cold case. The identity of the man in the white mask remains a total cipher. He was a professional who treated death like a meticulous piece of art. The hearts that were taken were never recovered, leaving a physical and emotional hole in the history of the town. The silence of the Belgian night is deep and heavy, carrying the echo of a sound that no one wants to hear again. But as we move from the foggy parks of Aalst to the sun-drenched roads of Australia, we find a different kind of precision. August 24, 1976. In the quiet town of Colac, Victoria, Peter Watts is sitting at a small wooden desk in his bedroom, carefully organizing a stack of honors-level textbooks. He is 18 years old and has a reputation for being one of the most disciplined students in his class. The room smells of lemon wax and the faint, dusty scent of old paper. He reaches for a black ink pen and begins to write a short note on a piece of lined paper. His handwriting is precise and slanted, reflecting the same order he brings to every part of his life. He leaves the note on his pillow, ensuring it is positioned where his parents will see it as soon as they walk in. He checks the time on his wristwatch and stands up to grab his jacket. Peter is a young man of consistent habits, someone who typically accounts for every minute of his day. He spends his afternoons at the local library or helping his father with chores around the house. Today, he has a plan that falls outside his normal routine, a task he has described only as helping a friend. He adjusts the laces on his brown leather shoes, making sure the knots are tight and symmetrical. He has a near-future expectation of starting his university courses in just a few weeks. His desk is already prepared for the transition, with empty notebooks and a new set of pens waiting for the first lecture. He possesses a small, silver coin that he keeps in his pocket for luck, a detail that most of his peers would find surprisingly sentimental. He touches the coin one last time before stepping out into the cool evening air. The sun is beginning to dip behind the rolling hills of Victoria, casting long, purple shadows across the driveway. Peter walks toward the edge of the property, his footsteps sounding muffled on the damp grass. He does not look back at the house, moving with a sense of purpose that suggests he is expected somewhere specific. The ordinary life of a small-town student is still moving around him, but he is already stepping away from it. He reaches the main road and sees a dark vehicle idling near a stand of eucalyptus trees. It is a car he does not recognize, a heavy sedan with tinted windows that obscure the driver's face. The engine is running with a low, steady purr that vibrates in the still air of the evening. This is the first strange detail that cracks the quiet surface of his Tuesday night. Peter approaches the passenger side of the car and pauses for a brief second. He seems to be waiting for a signal or a word from the person behind the wheel. The window slides down only a few inches, revealing nothing but the darkness of the interior and the smell of expensive cologne. Peter opens the door and slides into the seat, closing it softly behind him. The car pulls away from the curb before he has even settled into the upholstery. He notices that the driver is wearing thin, black leather gloves and is staring straight ahead at the road. They do not exchange a greeting or discuss the destination. Peter looks out the window as the familiar landmarks of Colac begin to disappear into the twilight. He tries to rationalize the situation, telling himself that his friend is in some kind of trouble that requires this level of secrecy. He assumes they are heading to a nearby town or perhaps a house on the outskirts of the district. But the car does not slow down as they reach the turnoff for the local hospital. It continues to accelerate, the needle on the speedometer climbing steadily toward the right. The driver reaches over and pushes a button on the dashboard, locking all four doors with a heavy, mechanical thud. There is no longer a clean way for Peter to change his mind or ask to be let out. He realizes that the person next to him has no intention of stopping for a conversation. The interior of the car feels suddenly confined and much smaller than it did moments ago. The tires hum with a high, constant pitch against the asphalt of the highway. The only light inside the cabin is the dim green glow of the dashboard, casting long, distorted shadows across Peter's lap. The pressure of the high speed begins to push him back into the seat, making his chest feel tight and heavy. He thinks to himself that he never got the chance to return the library book about ancient history. Hours pass in a blur of dark scenery and the rhythmic flashing of distant road signs. Peter watches the moon climb higher into the sky, tracking the movement of the stars through the glass of the window. He is functionally alone in the car, separated from the driver by a wall of silence and an unknown intent. He begins to realize that the friend he was going to help may not exist at all. The geography of the landscape begins to change, shifting from the lush greenery of Victoria to the flatter, drier terrain of the South Australian border. Peter knows they have traveled a distance that should have taken half a day. Yet the driver has not stopped for fuel or a rest. The old logic of travel and time is starting to break down in the face of this relentless movement. At 1:30 in the morning, a passing motorist is driving down Helpman Terrace in a desolate area of Adelaide. He notices a dark shape lying in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights for a split second. He slows his vehicle down, thinking he has encountered a fallen branch or perhaps a kangaroo. He pulls over to the shoulder and steps out into the salt air of the nearby coast. He finds a young man collapsed on the pavement, lying in a position that suggests he was placed there rather than fallen. The boy is wearing a neat jacket and trousers, and his hair is perfectly combed as if he has just stepped out of a bathroom. His skin is pale and cool to the touch, and his breathing is shallow and ragged. The motorist notices that the boy is missing his right shoe. An ambulance arrives 10 minutes later and transports the boy to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. The air in the emergency room is filled with the smell of sharp antiseptic and the sound of machines. Doctors work quickly to stabilize him, but the boy dies shortly after arrival without regaining consciousness. They find no identification on his person, no wallet, and no wristwatch. The police in Adelaide begin a reconstructive investigation to determine the identity of the boy and how he came to be on Helpman Terrace. They distribute his description to stations across the country, looking for any reports of missing teenagers. Within 24 hours, they receive a call from the police in Colac, Victoria. They confirm that the boy is Peter Watts, who was reported missing by his parents earlier that evening. The investigation quickly uncovers a series of facts that seem to defy the laws of physics. Peter was last seen at his home in Victoria at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He was found dying in Adelaide at 1:30 the following morning. The distance between the two locations is nearly 800 kilometers of winding roads and highway. Driving that distance in under 9.5 hours would require a vehicle to maintain a constant speed of nearly 90 kilometers per hour without stopping. In 1976, with the road conditions and speed limits of the time, such a journey was considered almost impossible. It would have required a driver with intimate knowledge of the route and a high-performance engine. The autopsy of Peter Watts provides more questions than answers for the lead detectives. They find that he suffered massive internal injuries, including a ruptured liver and damaged lungs. These are injuries typically seen in victims of high-speed falls or people who have been thrown from a moving vehicle. However, there is a total lack of the external trauma that usually accompanies such an event. Peter's clothes are not torn or scuffed, and there is no road rash on his skin. There are no gravel fragments in his wounds, and no signs of a struggle on his hands or under his fingernails. His clothing is so clean that it appears he was carefully dressed and groomed after the fatal injuries were sustained. The detectives begin to suspect that Peter was not a victim of an accident, but of a meticulous execution. They search the area around Helpman Terrace for the missing shoe, but they find nothing. They expand the search to the route between Victoria and South Australia, looking for any sign of a struggle or a discarded item. Several days later, a local resident in Colac finds Peter's right shoe sitting on the side of a quiet road just a few kilometers from his family home. It is sitting perfectly upright, as if someone had placed it there as a marker. The mystery of the shoe reinterprets the entire timeline of the evening. If Peter lost his shoe near his home, he would have traveled 800 kilometers in a state of distress or confinement. Yet when he was found, his appearance was described as calm and neat. This suggests that the person who took him was not just a kidnapper, but someone who viewed Peter as a project to be maintained. Investigators look into the theory of a secretive cult or a high-level political kidnapping. They find that Peter was a straight-edge student with no known enemies and no secret life. His family maintains that he had no friends in Adelaide and no reason to travel so far from home. The lack of a motive makes the precision of the crime even more disturbing for the community. The voice of the case becomes colder as the leads begin to dry up over the following months. They examine the logs of every gas station along the highway, but no one remembers seeing a dark sedan or a boy matching Peter's description. It is as if the vehicle moved through the landscape without ever touching the world around it. The case of the boy in the bush remains a cornerstone of Australian mysteries. The twist in the investigation arrives when a retired detective reviews the original forensic reports decades later. He notices that the internal injuries were not caused by a single impact, but by a sustained pressure applied to the torso. This suggests that Peter may have been crushed or held in a specialized restraint during the long journey. The neatness of his appearance was not a sign of care, but a sign of total control. The killer did not just take Peter to Adelaide to dispose of him. They used the 800 kilometers of highway as a private space to conduct an experiment in fear and discipline. By the time they reached Helpman Terrace, the work was finished, and Peter was no longer needed. They placed him on the road like a discarded object and drove away into the night. The final verdict on the death of Peter Watts is a permanent status of unsolved. No suspect was ever charged, and the dark sedan was never found. The case is revisited every few years by historians and podcasters who try to solve the impossible math of the timeline. They look for a name or a face that was missed in the original chaos of 1976. Peter Watts was buried in Colac. Returned to the hills he never should have left. His bedroom was kept exactly as he left it for a long time, with the textbooks and the black ink pen waiting for a student who never came home. The silver coin he kept for luck was never found, leaving his pocket as empty as the road where he died. The road on Helpman Terrace is still there, a quiet stretch of asphalt near the coast. The salt air still smells of the ocean, and the shadows of the eucalyptus trees still dance in the moonlight. But the mystery of the boy who traveled across a continent in a single night remains buried in the red dust. Some journeys are not meant to be understood by those who stay behind. It is the night of December 1st, 1976, in the city of Pune, India. Shrikant Abhyankar is standing in the kitchen of his family's quiet bungalow, pouring a final glass of water before heading to bed. He is in his mid-20s and lives in a neighborhood known for its academic prestige and old-world charm. The air inside the house is warm and carries the faint, lingering scent of turmeric and sandalwood from the evening meal. He moves through the living room, checking the heavy iron bolts on the front door with a practiced hand. Outside, the street is silent except for the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant muffled sound of a scooter engine. Shrikant takes comfort in the solidness of the walls and the familiarity of the routine he has performed every night for years. He turns off the main light, leaving the room bathed in the soft, blue glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Shrikant lives under the quiet gravity of high expectations, working toward a career that will honor his father's reputation in the community. He is a man who values the safety of his family above all else, often waking up in the middle of the night to double-check the window latches. He has a near-future plan to renovate the back garden for his elderly parents, envisioning a space filled with jasmine and marigolds. He carries a small, brass key to a private desk in his pocket, a detail that reflects his need for order and privacy. He walks down the narrow hallway toward his bedroom, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished stone floor. He passes the rooms where his parents and younger siblings are already asleep, their steady breathing the only sound in the house. The ceiling fans rotate with a low, hypnotic hum that pushes the humid air around the rooms. Shrikant feels a sense of deep peace, believing that the world outside their gate is far removed from the sanctuary of their home. He is about to close his own bedroom door when he notices a strange shadow flickering against the wall of the veranda. It is not the jagged shape of a tree branch or the soft blur of a passing cloud. It is the distinct, sharp outline of a human head, perfectly still and positioned just outside the frosted glass of the side window. Shrikant freezes, his hand still resting on the wooden doorframe as he tries to rationalize what he is seeing. He assumes it must be a neighbor's son looking for a lost ball, or perhaps a stray animal caught in the light. But as he watches, a second shadow joins the first, followed by the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against the window frame. This is the first strange detail that cracks the quiet safety of the Abyankar household. The figures outside are moving with a level of coordination that suggests they have done this many times before. Shrikant walks toward the window, intending to shout a warning and scare the intruders away. Before he can reach the glass, he hears the soft, mechanical click of the latch being forced upward from the outside. The window swings inward with a slow, agonizing creak that sounds like a scream in the silence of the night. A hand wearing a heavy silver college ring reaches through the opening and grips the edge of the frame. The ordinary logic of a break-in suggests that the men will demand money or jewelry and then flee into the night. But as the first figure climbs into the room, Shrikant notices he is carrying a coil of bright yellow nylon rope and a small glass bottle. The man is young, well-dressed, and has the clean-cut appearance of a university student. He does not look like a criminal, but his eyes are wide and shining with an unnatural, frantic energy. Shrikant tries to turn back toward the hallway to wake his father, but a second man is already through the window. He is grabbed from behind, a heavy arm wrapping around his chest with surprising strength. The air is suddenly filled with the sweet, sickly scent of chloroform, a smell so overwhelming that it makes his head swim. The floor seems to tilt beneath his feet as the pressure of the situation collapses around him. The immersion of the moment locks Shrikant into the terrifying reality of the hallway. He can feel the rough, abrasive texture of the nylon rope against his wrists and the biting cold of the stone floor on his bare skin. The pressure of a hand over his mouth is so tight that he can taste the salt and sweat of the stranger's palm. He thinks to himself that the students he saw at the tea stall earlier that day had the exact same laugh as the man now standing over him. He watches in a blur of fading consciousness as the four young men move through the house with clinical efficiency. They do not whisper or argue, moving instead like a team of artists working on a shared project. They use the nylon ropes to secure every member of the family, working with a speed that suggests they have practiced these movements in a different setting. Shrikant realizes with a final, cold jolt of clarity that these are not thieves looking for riches. The escalation of the night is a descent into a specific kind of madness that Pune has never seen before. The intruders, led by a charismatic art student named Rajendra Jackal, begin to systematically eliminate every witness in the house. They use the ropes not just for restraint, but as a primary tool for their work. The struggle is brief and one-sided, as the family is caught between sleep and a reality they cannot comprehend. The following morning, a local milk delivery man notices that the front gate of the Abyankar house is standing wide open. He finds the scene inside and alerts the neighbors, who call the police to the quiet residential street. The lead inspector arrives to find a crime scene that looks more like a ritual than a robbery. The precision of the killings and the lack of a clear motive lead the investigators to believe they are dealing with a gang of professional dacoits from outside the state. The investigation into the Joshi and Abyankar families initially focuses on business rivalries and property disputes. They search for hardened criminals with a history of using ropes, but every lead turns into a dead end. The breakthrough only comes when a student at the local commercial art college notices his classmates acting strangely. They have a sudden influx of cash and are frequently seen riding new, expensive motorcycles through the city. The police pick up Rajendra Jackal and his three friends for questioning, initially suspecting them of simple bicycle thefts. During the interrogation, the facade of the polite, middle-class students begins to crumble. Jackal does not try to hide his involvement. Instead, he begins to describe the murders with a sense of pride and artistic accomplishment. He explains that the group had become bored with their studies and wanted to experience the thrill of absolute power. The twist in the case reinterprets the normality of the students as the very thing that made them dangerous. They had used their status as clean-cut college boys to scout neighborhoods and gain the trust of their victims. The shadow killings were not a means to an end, but were the end itself. A dark masterpiece they were creating in the sleeping homes of Pune. They had even kept detailed notes and sketches of their crimes in their lockers at the art school. The voice of the city turns to absolute horror as the details of the thrill-seeking motive are released to the public. The realization that the killers were the children of respectable families destroys the community's sense of safety. The trial is one of the most high-profile in Indian history, revealing a pattern of violence that had escalated from petty theft to mass murder over the course of a single year. The students show no remorse, maintaining their detached, clinical demeanor until the very end. The final verdict for Rajendra Jakal, Munawar Shah, Dilip Dianwar, and Shantaram Kanhoji is a simultaneous sentence of death. They are executed together in 1983, a rare event that marks the end of a terrifying chapter for the city. The Abhyankar house remains standing, but it is forever changed. Serving as a physical landmark of the night, the shadows came inside. The garden that Shrikant had planned to fix was never finished, leaving only a patch of dry earth behind the gate. The city of Pune eventually recovered its reputation as a center of learning, but the culture of safety was permanently altered. People began to install heavier locks and taller gates, no longer trusting the polite young men who walked the streets at night. The nylon ropes and the bottles of chloroform were destroyed as evidence, but the memory of their use persists in the local lore. Some crimes are so senseless that they leave a permanent stain on the ground where they happened. The Abhyankar family was buried in a ceremony that drew thousands of mourners from across the region. They were remembered as a family of peace who were caught in a storm of someone else's making. The silver college ring that Shrikant saw in the moonlight was returned to a different family, a small object that carried the weight of 10 lives. The polished stone floors of the bungalow were cleaned, but the silence in the hallway remained. Today, students still walk past the house on their way to the art college, their laughter echoing off the white walls. Most of them do not know the names of the people who lived there in 1976, but the older residents still look at the windows whenever they hear a scooter idling in the dark. They know that the most dangerous people are often the ones who look exactly like everyone else. The red dust of Pune eventually settles on everything, covering the scars of the past with a layer of heat and time. But as we move from the residential streets of India to the freezing rivers of Canada, we find a different kind of silence. There, a woman's identity is bound by a series of silk neckties, waiting 50 years for someone to call her by her real name. May 3rd, 1975, in the city of Montreal, Quebec. Jewel Parchman Langford is walking out of a high-end boutique on Sherbrooke Street, carrying a small paper bag tied with a satin ribbon. She is 48 years old and possesses the effortless poise of a woman who has built a successful empire from the ground up in the American South. The air is cool and smells of damp pavement and the faint, a sweet scent of blooming lilacs from a nearby park. She is the co-owner of a flourishing spa and trucking company in Jackson, Tennessee, a dual career that requires both a sharp mind for logistics and an eye for luxury. Her life is a series of scheduled meetings, inventory checks, and social engagements that she manages with a calm, professional grace. She is in Montreal to visit a longtime friend and take a short break from the humid heat and demanding routine of her office. Jewel has a habit of checking her gold wristwatch every hour, a small ritual that keeps her grounded in the movement of the day. It was a gift to herself for hitting a major business milestone, and the weight of the metal on her wrist feels like a physical reminder of her own independence. She is looking forward to her flight back to Nashville the following morning, where a stack of new contracts is waiting for her final approval. She has a near-future plan to expand her spa business into the neighboring counties, envisioning a network of wellness centers that reflect her own high standards. She carries a specific shade of coral lipstick in her handbag, applying it precisely every 3 hours to maintain her polished appearance. She is a woman who is rarely surprised by life, as she has spent decades planning for every possible outcome in her business and her home. She walks toward the curb at the end of the block, looking for the black sedan that she arranged to take her back to her hotel. The city around her is bustling with the energy of a spring evening, with people rushing toward restaurants and theaters. Jewel stands perfectly still, a calm figure in the middle of the urban flow, waiting for the ride that will mark the end of her Canadian holiday. A man is standing next to a clean, late-model vehicle near the corner, but it is not the taxi Jewel was expecting. He is dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt, looking more like a corporate executive than a professional driver. He smiles politely and motions for her to step toward the car, explaining that the original service was delayed and he has been sent as a high-quality replacement. Jewel notices that the man has several silk neckties draped over his arm, each featuring a bold and sophisticated pattern. He uses them to neatly secure her leather suitcase in the back seat, moving with a level of care that seems slightly excessive for a simple airport run. This is the first strange detail that cracks the surface of her evening. But the man's respectful tone and expensive clothing provide a sense of false security. She slides into the passenger seat, and the man closes the door with a firm, muted click that echoes in the quiet interior of the cabin. As they pull away from the curb, Jewel realizes that the driver has not asked for her destination or the name of her hotel. He steers the car away from the familiar landmarks of the city center, heading instead toward the main highway that leads west toward the Ontario border. Jewel reaches for the door handle, but it is locked from the driver's side and does not budge under her hand. She tries to use her professional voice, the one she uses to negotiate with difficult suppliers, asking the man to stop at the nearest intersection. He does not turn his head or acknowledge her presence, keeping his eyes fixed on the gray ribbon of the road as the city lights begin to fade behind them. The urban skyline of Montreal is quickly replaced by a blur of industrial warehouses and dark, empty fields. Jewel realizes that the man's polished exterior was merely a mask for a predator who has been watching her since she arrived in the city. The interior of the car feels suddenly freezing, and the ordinary logic of her trip has been replaced by a reality she cannot negotiate her way out of. The car hits a small bump on the rural highway, and the scent of the man's expensive wood smoke cologne fills the small, enclosed space. Jewel feels the cool, slippery texture of a polyester necktie against the skin of her bare wrist as she tries to push herself away from the center console. The pressure of the high speed vibrates through the seat and into her spine, making her chest feel tight with a sudden, sharp panic. She thinks to herself that her business partner will wonder why she did not call to say she had arrived safely at the airport. On May 3, 1975, a farmer in Castleman, Ontario, is walking along the muddy banks of the Nation River. He is checking the water levels after a heavy spring rain, looking for any debris that might clog the irrigation pipes for his fields. He spots a large, colorful bundle snagged on a fallen log near the base of a high concrete bridge that carries the highway over the water. He initially assumes it is a bag of discarded rags or perhaps a bundle of old towels that floated down from one of the towns upstream. He uses a long branch to pull the object closer to the shore, intending to clear the blockage before the current pulls it further down the river. As the bundle rolls over in the shallow water, the farmer realizes with a jolt of horror that he is looking at a human body. The victim is wrapped in a collection of household rags and towels, bound tightly into a fetal position with a series of men's neckties. The ties are made of high-quality silk and polyester, featuring bright colors and intricate patterns that seem completely out of place in the dark river mud. The local police arrive and determine that the woman was strangled, but they find no identification and no jewelry on her person. The investigation quickly hits a wall, as the woman does not match any missing persons reports in the province of Ontario. She is a Jane Doe, a nameless ghost who ended up 1,000 miles away from her true life. Forensic experts examine the neckties, noting that they were tied with a specific kind of precision that suggests a killer who took pride in his own appearance. They begin to refer to her as the Nation River Lady, a title that will follow her for decades. For nearly 50 years, the case remains one of Canada's most frustrating cold mysteries. The police share the woman's description and the images of the patterned neckties with authorities across North America. But no one comes forward with a name. She is buried in a potter's field with a simple stone marker, her identity reduced to a set of measurements in a dusty evidence locker. The bridge in Castleman continues to carry thousands of cars over the water every day, and the story of the woman found in the river fades into a local legend. The detectives who first worked the case retire, passing their notes to a new generation of investigators who refuse to let the file be closed. They focus on the dandy signature of the neckties, believing that the killer left behind a piece of his own identity in the knots. The voice of the investigation turns colder and more clinical as the years pass without a breakthrough. They examine the towels and the rags for any microscopic traces of DNA. But the technology of the 1970s was not advanced enough to capture the evidence they needed. The Nation River lady remains a void in the criminal record, a successful life that was erased in a single afternoon. In 2023, the Ontario Provincial Police utilized modern forensic genealogy to finally break the long silence of the case. They build a complete DNA profile from a small sample preserved in the original investigation and search through international public databases. The search leads them across the border to the Parchman family in Tennessee, who had been looking for a missing relative for 5 decades. They learned that the Nation River lady was Jewel Parchman Langford, the respected businesswoman who had vanished during her trip to Montreal in 1975. Her family had never stopped searching for her, but they had no reason to look for a body in a remote Canadian river. The discovery of her name changes the entire direction of the investigation, shifting the focus from a nameless victim to a targeted crime. The realization that Jewel was taken 1,000 miles away from her home highlights the terrifying ease with which a person can be discarded across international borders. The dandy signature was not just a random choice of a killer, but a tool of a predator who lived a double life of refinement and violence. The neckties were the only things he felt were worthy of binding a woman of Jewel's status. The search for the person who tied those knots is currently an active murder investigation being coordinated by the authorities in both Canada and the United States. Jewel Langford's remains were finally returned to Tennessee, where she was buried next to her parents in the town of Jackson. Her family was able to close a chapter of their lives that had remained open for nearly half a century. The patterned neckties are still kept in a high-security vault in Ontario, physical echoes of a killer who has managed to hide in plain sight since the 1970s. They are no longer just evidence in a cold case, but are the primary leads in a hunt for a man who is now in the final years of his life. The case serves as a reminder that the truth has a way of rising to the surface. Even after 50 years in the water of the Nation River still flows under the concrete bridge in Castleman, cold and indifferent to the history it witnessed. The silky texture of a polyester necktie is a small, quiet thing until it is used to hold a weight that was never meant to be carried. The memory of Jewel Langford is no longer a mystery, but a story of a woman whose name was finally louder than the silence of the river. It is July 1st, 1975, in the village of Upilio, overlooking the dark waters of Lake Como. Christina Mazzotti is standing on the wooden pier of her family's villa, smoothing out the hem of a white silk dress. She is 18 years old and has spent the entire day celebrating the completion of her final high school exams. The air is warm and heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the cool, damp smell of the lake. She moves with a lightness that comes from a sense of total freedom and the promise of a long summer ahead. Christina is the daughter of Helios Mazzotti, a prominent and wealthy grain merchant who is well known in the Lombardy region. She has spent her childhood in a world of private tutors, luxury speedboats, and quiet afternoon parties by the water. She checks her reflection in the darkened glass of the villa's sliding doors, adjusting a small gold necklace that caught the light. Christina possesses a routine of taking the family's mahogany speedboat out for a solo run every evening before sunset. She enjoys the way the spray hits her face and the rhythmic slapping of the hull against the small waves. It is her private time to think about her future and the university courses she will begin in the fall. She always returns exactly 10 minutes after the sun disappears behind the mountains, securing the lines with a precise double knot. She has a near-future expectation of attending a large gala in Milan the following week, a reward from her father for her academic success. She carries a small, embroidered handkerchief in her clutch bag, a gift from her grandmother that she takes to every important event. She is a young woman who believes that her life is as solid and permanent as the stone walls of the villa. She does not yet understand that the Italy of 1975 is a place where wealth is often viewed as a target. Her father, Elios, lives under a constant, quiet pressure that he tries to keep hidden from his children. The country is currently gripped by the years of lead, a period of intense political unrest and a rising industry of high-profile kidnappings. He has spent the last month increasing the security around the grain warehouses and checking the locks on the villa gates twice every night. He carries the weight of his success like a heavy coat, always looking for a shadow that does not belong. Christina leaves the pier and walks toward her brother's car, which is parked in the gravel driveway of the estate. They are heading back to a friend's house for a secondary celebration, a smaller gathering of their closest peers. The moon is a thin sliver in the sky, providing just enough light to see the winding road that hugs the edge of the lake. She slides into the passenger seat and waves to her father, who is standing on the balcony with his hands in his pockets. The car moves away from the villa, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the mountain passes. The road is narrow and steep, with sharp bends that require constant attention from her brother, Giuliano. They are laughing about a joke from the party, the sound of their voices filling the small, warm interior of the vehicle. This is the ordinary life of the Mazzotti family, a sequence of celebrations and shared moments that feel unbreakable. The first strange detail appears as they reach a particularly isolated stretch of road near the village of Longone al Segrino. A large, dark van is parked sideways across the lane, its hazard lights flickering with a rhythmic fend. Orange glow. Giuliano slows the car down, assuming there has been an accident or a mechanical failure. He rolls down the window to ask if anyone needs assistance, his voice echoing in the silent valley. A group of men in military-style jumpsuits and balaclavas step out from behind the van, their movements synchronized and silent. They are holding automatic weapons and high-powered flashlights that blind Christina and her brother in an instant. The ordinary logic of a roadside emergency is replaced by a cold, predatory reality. Giuliano tries to put the car in reverse, but a second vehicle has pulled up directly behind them, pinning them into a small, dark trap. The immersion of the moment hits Christina with the force of a physical collapse. She can feel the rough, damp concrete of the road against her palms and the stinging smell of burnt rubber and motor oil. The pressure of a cold metal barrel is pressed firmly against her jaw, forcing her head back against the upholstery. She thinks to herself that she should have stayed on the boat for just 5 more minutes tonight. The men work with a terrifying professional detachment. Ignoring Giuliano's pleas and focusing entirely on Christina, they drag her from the car and throw her into the back of the dark van, binding her hands with thick plastic zip ties. The doors are slammed shut and the vehicle accelerates into the night, leaving her brother standing alone on the gravel. There is no shout, no struggle, and no clean way to track the direction of the kidnappers. The escalation of the crime moves quickly from a roadside snatching to a complex financial negotiation. Helios Mazzotti receives a phone call the following morning from a man who speaks with a heavy, unidentifiable accent. The caller demands a ransom of 1 billion lire, an astronomical sum that represents the majority of the family's liquid assets. He tells Helios that any involvement of the police will result in the immediate disposal of his daughter. For the next several weeks, the Mazzotti villa becomes a command center for a desperate and frantic search. Helios works around the clock to liquidate his holdings and gather the cash, following a series of cryptic instructions delivered through payphones across northern Italy. He is forced to drive for hours through the countryside, dropping bags of money at remote landmarks and then waiting for a signal that never comes. The voice of the kidnappers becomes colder and more demanding with every contact. The investigation is a reconstruction of missed signals and false promises that span several months. The police monitor the phone lines and set up roadblocks, but the kidnappers always seem to be one step ahead of the authorities. They use a network of safe houses and burner vehicles that make them almost invisible in the rural landscape. The public watches the case with a mixture of horror and fascination, as the beauty of the lake becomes a symbol of the country's lawlessness. Helios eventually succeeds in paying the full 1 billion lire, delivering the final payment to a location near the Swiss border. He returns to the villa and waits for the phone call, telling him where he can pick up his daughter. He spends 3 days sitting by the telephone, refusing to eat or sleep, his eyes fixed on the driveway. But the phone remains silent, and the kidnappers vanish into the shadows of the underground economy. The reconstruction of the tragedy does not occur until 1977, when a low-level criminal is arrested for an unrelated crime in Milan. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he provides the location of a small garage in the town of Varalino. He tells the police that the Mazzati girl was never kept in a luxury villa or a mountain retreat. She was taken to a place designed for storage, not for a living person. The police raid the garage and find a small trapdoor hidden under a pile of discarded tires and old engine parts. Beneath the floor is a concrete bunker, no larger than a coffin, with no lights and no ventilation. The air inside is thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. They find the remains of a young woman wrapped in a white silk dress that had become gray and tattered over the long months of confinement. The twist in the case reveals a level of cruelty that shocked even the most hardened investigators. The autopsy shows that Christina did not die from violence or a botched escape attempt. She had succumbed to the horrific conditions of the hole and the high doses of sedatives her captors had given her to keep her quiet. The medical examiner concludes that she had likely passed away only a few days after the kidnapping, long before the first ransom payment was even made. The kidnappers had spent weeks extorting a grieving father for a daughter they knew was already dead. They had listened to his pleas and taken his life savings, while her body sat in a hole only a few miles from a busy highway. The realization that the entire negotiation was a choreographed lie destroyed Helios Mazzati's health and his spirit. He had paid a fortune to buy back a life that had already been extinguished by the very first dose of medication. The verdict for the men responsible for the kidnapping was eventually delivered in a closed court in the 1980s. A cell linked to the Ndrangheta crime syndicate was identified, and several members were sentenced to life in prison. But the money was never recovered, and the leaders of the group managed to flee the country before the arrests were made. The case remains a landmark in Italian law, leading to the creation of the frozen assets law that prevents families from paying ransoms. Christina Mazzati was buried in a quiet ceremony in Opilio, her grave overlooking the lake she loved. The villa was sold shortly after, as the family could no longer bear to look at the water and the empty pier. The gravesite became a place of pilgrimage for local students, who left white flowers and small notes for the girl who never got to have her summer. The mahogany speedboat was found drifting in the center of the lake months later, its engine silent and its mahogany deck bleached by the sun. The aftershock of the kidnapping changed the social fabric of the Lombardy region for a generation. Wealthy families began to move into high-security apartments in Milan, leaving behind the open villas and the lakeside life. The silence of the garage in Varalino became a dark echo in the national memory, a reminder of the price that was paid for a diploma in 1975. The hole under the floor was filled with concrete, but the air in that town always felt a little heavier afterward. The final drop of the story is found in the belongings Christina left behind in her bedroom. Among the textbooks and the coral lipsticks was a small diary she had started on the morning of her final exam. The last entry is dated July 1st, 1975, and consists of only 4 words written in a hurried, happy hand. It simply says, "Everything begins tomorrow morning." The cool air of Lake Como is a sharp contrast to the damp, pine-scented forests of northern Europe. In Norway, the trees are so thick that they can swallow a person's history and leave behind only a collection of wigs and a half-burned passport. There, a woman with 4 languages and 5 identities is walking toward a valley where no one is supposed to find her. It is a damp afternoon in November, 1975, in the city of Bergen, Norway. A woman is standing in front of the vanity mirror in room 407 of the Hotel Orion, carefully adjusting a dark brown wig. She is 28 years old and moves with a calculated, rhythmic precision that suggests every action has been rehearsed 1,000 times. The room smells of lavender soap in the cold, salty mist blowing in from the North Sea. She is known to the hotel staff as Genevieve, a quiet traveler who speaks French with a slight Belgian accent. In reality, she carries 5 different identities in her leather handbag, each one as thin and fragile as the paper it is printed on. She has spent the last 3 weeks moving between high-end hotels in Oslo, Stavanger, and Bergen, never staying in one place for more than 4 nights. Her life is a series of checkouts and check-ins, a constant cycle of erasing her presence before it can leave a shadow. Genevieve enjoys the anonymity of the crowded hotel lobbies and the rhythmic sound of the train tracks beneath her feet. She has a routine of visiting the local post office every morning to check a specific rental box. Though she never seems to receive any mail, she spends her afternoons walking through the city, her eyes constantly scanning the reflections in the shop windows for a face she recognizes. The air in Bergen is crisp and carries the faint, industrial scent of the fish markets and the heavy oil from the shipping lanes. She lives under the everyday gravity of a mission that requires her to be everyone and no one at the same time. She has a near-future hope of a small, quiet apartment in a country where she can finally use her real name. She has a habit of counting the number of steps from the hotel elevator to her door, a detail that keeps her mind sharp and focused on her surroundings. She wears a small gold ring on her right hand, a personal detail that she hides under her leather gloves whenever she leaves the room. Genevieve reaches for a small, sharp razor blade hidden inside a sewing kit on the desk. She spends the next 20 minutes meticulously removing the brand labels from her new wool coat and her silk stockings. She leaves no threads behind, ensuring that her clothing cannot be traced back to a specific store or country. This is a repeated habit, a ritual of erasure that she performs with every new item she acquires during her travels. She packs her leather suitcase with the efficiency of a soldier, folding her sweaters and dresses into neat, compressed layers. She leaves a small tip for the maid on the bedside table and checks the room one last time for any forgotten items. She is a woman who leaves nothing behind, not even a stray hair or a fingerprint on a glass. She walks out of the room and closes the door with a soft, final click that signals the end of her time in Bergen. The first strange detail appears as she reaches the lobby and prepares to settle her bill in cash. She notices a man sitting in a wingback chair near the fireplace, his face partially hidden behind a German newspaper. It is the same newspaper, with the same headline about the NATO naval exercises, that she saw a man reading in Brussels 4 days ago. She pays the clerk without looking back, her pulse quickening as the ordinary logic of a chance encounter begins to fail. She walks out of the hotel and into the gray drizzle of the afternoon, her boots clicking on the wet pavement. She makes her way toward the central train station, intending to drop her luggage in a storage locker before her final meeting. She notices the man from the lobby standing near a taxi stand across the street, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark trench coat. He is not following her directly, but he is moving at a pace that keeps him within sight of her colorful umbrella. Genevieve reaches the station and secures her suitcase in locker number 12, sliding the key into the lining of her glove. She decides to abandon her plan to take the evening train to Oslo, sensing that her route has been compromised by someone who knows her habits. She walks toward the bus terminal, choosing a local line that heads toward the outskirts of the city and the dense forests of the Isdalen Valley. She tells herself that she can lose any tail in the steep, wooded terrain where the fog is thickest. She exits the bus at the final stop, near the entrance to a trail known locally as Death Valley. The path is narrow and slippery, with wet pine needles, winding upward into a landscape of jagged rocks and stunted trees. The air here is colder and smells of damp earth and the acrid scent of ancient glaciers. The silence of the forest is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water from the high branches. The immersion of the moment locks Genevieve into the physical reality of the valley. She can feel the biting chill of the mountain air on her cheeks and the uneven, rocky ground shifting under the soles of her boots. The pressure of the silence feels like a tightening circle, and she realizes that the sound of the bus engine has completely faded away. She thinks to herself that they promised her the woods would be the safest place to disappear. She reaches a small clearing near a frozen stream and stops to catch her breath in the fading light. She hears the snap of a dry branch behind her, a sound that is too heavy to be a bird or a small animal. She turns around and sees 3 figures emerging from the mist, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. They are not the enemies she was trained to avoid, but are the very people she was told to trust for her extraction. The escalation of the night moves with a clinical, cold speed that leaves no room for negotiation or escape. Genevieve realizes that her mission was not a test of her skill, but was a choreographed journey toward her own erasure. She has become a liability to an agency that prefers ghosts over living witnesses who know too much about naval ship movements. She does not scream as they move toward her, her training holding her steady even as the world begins to go dark. Several days later, a local hiker is exploring the remote sections of the Isdalen Valley when he notices a strange sight near a rock scree. He finds a collection of items arranged in a ritualistic fashion, including a half-burned passport and a set of brown wigs. Nearby, he discovers the remains of a woman lying in a shallow depression, her body partially charred by a small, controlled fire. He notices that all the labels have been removed from her clothing with surgical precision. The Norwegian police arrive and begin a reconstructive investigation that quickly draws the attention of national intelligence. They find that the woman's fingerprints have been partially sanded down, and her dental work features high-end porcelain not found in Scandinavia. They recover a small notebook from a hollowed-out tree trunk, filled with cryptic dates and locations that match the movements of NATO vessels. The voice of the investigation turns cold as the lead inspector is told to halt the inquiry for reasons of national security. The investigation into the Bergen Woods mystery reveals a pattern of behavior that suggests a highly trained sleeper agent. Every hotel room she occupied was found scrubbed of DNA, and her luggage in the station locker contained nothing but anonymous, label-less clothing. The police are unable to find a single person who can identify her real name or her country of origin. She is a total cipher, a woman who was erased from the world by the very hands that created her identities. The twist in the case comes years later when a retired intelligence officer reviews the forensic files in private. He notices that the charring on the body was not meant to destroy the remains, but was a specific method of neutralizing certain chemical markers in the skin. The fire was a tool used by professional cleaners to ensure that no toxicological evidence could be recovered from the scene. The woman was not just killed, she was processed like a piece of classified data that was no longer required. The final verdict on the unknown woman of the Bergen Woods is a permanent status of unidentified. She was buried in a nameless grave in a quiet corner of the city cemetery, her file marked as a state secret. No family ever came forward to claim her, and no country ever acknowledged her existence on their soil. She remains the most famous ghost in Norwegian history, a reminder of a war that was fought in the shadows of the North Sea. The aftershock of the discovery led to a total restructuring of how foreign travelers were monitored in the coastal cities of Norway. The Hotel Orion updated its check-in procedures, and the woods of Isdalen became a site of morbid curiosity for historians of the Cold War. But the woman herself has been lost to time, her 5 identities sitting in a dusty box in an archive that no one is allowed to open. The silver ring she wore was never recovered, likely taken as a trophy or destroyed in the fire. The half-burned passport sits in an evidence locker, its pages curled and blackened by the flames. It is a physical echo of a life that was lived in the gaps between the truth and a well-crafted lie. The valley of Isdalen is still quiet, the fog still clinging to the jagged rocks and the wet pine needles. But the secret of the woman who spoke 4 languages is still buried deep under the mountain shadows. It is 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in October, 1976. In the Quebrada de las Conchas of northern Argentina, Leslie Gordon is standing on a high sandstone ridge, looking out over the jagged red rock formations of the Salta Canyons. She is 24 years old and has spent the last year working as a traveling nurse across South America. The air is already hot and carries the scent of dry, ancient dust and the faint, herbal smell of sagebrush. She moves with the confident ease of a veteran hiker, her heavy canvas backpack shifting comfortably against her shoulders. Leslie is a woman who finds peace in the silence of high places and the sharp clarity of the mountain sun. She has a routine of waking up before dawn to reach the highest peaks before the afternoon heat becomes unbearable. She stops to take a sip of water from her canteen, feeling the grit of the red sand between her teeth. Leslie is a woman who lives under the quiet pressure of a high-stress career in a busy hospital back in the United States. She chose this trip to escape the constant alarms and the weight of responsibility for her patients. She has a near-future plan to reach the border of Bolivia by the end of the month, where she hopes to see the salt flats. She carries a small, silver whistle on a cord around her neck, a gift from her father that she has never had a reason to use. She walks toward the edge of a deep, narrow fissure known as the Devil's Throat, where the walls are nearly vertical and the ground is covered in loose shale. The canyon is a maze of hidden caves and wind-carved pillars that seem to change shape as the sun moves across the sky. Leslie finds a flat ledge and sets up her amateur camera on a small tripod. She wants to capture the way the light hits the deep orange veins in the rock before she continues her descent. She has a habit of documenting her journey through self-portraits, always making sure to include a piece of the landscape that she feels a connection to. She adjusts the timer on the camera and steps back toward the edge of the ledge, smoothing her hair and flashing a bright, genuine smile. The camera clicks, capturing a young woman who looks perfectly at home in the middle of a wilderness that most people would find terrifying. She is a solitary figure, a tiny speck of blue fabric against a vast ocean of red stone. The first strange detail appears as she leans over to retrieve her camera from the tripod. She notices a thin, dark line of tire tracks in the soft dust at the very bottom of the canyon, hundreds of feet below her position. This part of the park is supposed to be inaccessible to vehicles, with no roads or even wide trails leading into the deep basin. Leslie watches a small cloud of red dust rise from behind a distant pillar, moving with a speed that suggests a heavy engine is laboring through the sand. She tells herself it must be a park ranger or perhaps a local rancher checking on a stray animal in the lower canyon. She packs her camera into her bag and begins to navigate the steep path that leads toward the canyon floor. The sound of the wind through the sandstone slit creates a low, rhythmic moaning that masks the sounds of her own movement. She feels a sudden, sharp chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air as she enters the shadow of the Devil's Throat. Leslie reaches a narrow ledge halfway down the cliffside and stops to check her map for the next landmark. She hears a sound that makes her freeze, a rhythmic scraping of metal against rock coming from the cave directly beneath her feet. It is a dry, grating noise that sounds like a shovel or a heavy crowbar being used to move a large stone. She looks over the edge, but the angle is too sharp to see into the opening of the cavern below. The ordinary logic of the park suggests that someone is performing maintenance or perhaps looking for mineral samples in the sandstone. But the silence that follows the scraping is too heavy and intentional to be a worker going about their day. Leslie decides to skip the lower section of the trail and move back toward the main ridge where she can be seen by other hikers. She turns to head back the way she came, but she finds that the path she used to descend is now covered in a fresh layer of loose rock. The immersion of the moment locks Leslie into the vertical space of the canyon wall. She can feel the rough, abrasive heat of the red stone against her palms and the stinging glare of the high-altitude sun in her eyes. The pressure of the silence is like a physical hand pressing against her chest, making it difficult to breathe in the thin air. She thinks to herself that she never told the park ranger her exact route through the Devil's Throat this morning. She is trapped on a ledge no wider than a doorway, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of crumbling sandstone on the other. She reaches for her silver whistle, but her fingers are shaking so badly that she can barely find the cord under her jacket. She hears the sound of heavy boots climbing the path below her, the footsteps deliberate and steady. She looks down and sees a figure in dark clothing emerging from the shadow of the lower cave, holding a long piece of nylon rope. The escalation of the afternoon is a sequence of choices that lead toward an inevitable and silent disappearance. Leslie realizes that the figure below is not looking for a hiker in distress, but is moving toward her with a level of focus that leaves no room for hope. She tries to climb higher toward the ridge, but the sandstone breaks away in her hands like dry bread. The person below does not call out to her or offer any words of comfort as they close the distance between them. A week passes before a local hiker finds a small, kind, black camera sitting perfectly level on a flat rock near the entrance to the Devil's Throat. He turns it into the local police station in Salta, sparking a search that will eventually involve hundreds of volunteers and park rangers. The film is developed, revealing a series of photos of a smiling young woman standing on the edge of the abyss. The final photo in the roll is different from the others, showing a distant view of a dark sedan moving through a cloud of red dust in the basin below. The investigation is a reconstruction of a life that was erased in a place where no one was supposed to be watching. The park ranger, who was the last person to speak to Leslie, provides a statement that changes 3 times during the course of a single week. He initially claims she headed north, then insists she went south, and finally admits he never saw her leave the main gate at all. The police find her backpack neatly stacked near the lookout point, but her passport and her wallet have vanished into the dry air. For months, the Argentine mountains are combed by forensic experts and mountain rescue teams who find nothing but dead ends and empty caves. The search is hampered by the intense political instability of 1976, with the local authorities distracted by a national crisis that takes precedence over a missing tourist. Leslie Gordon becomes a name on a poster that slowly fades under the harsh Salta sun. She is a woman who stepped behind a rock and never came out, a puzzle with no missing pieces left on the ground. The voice of the mystery turns from a search for a survivor to a hunt for a perpetrator who knew the canyon better than any map. They search the records for any vehicles matching the description of the dark sedan seen in the final photo. But the car was never registered in the province. It is as if the vehicle and the driver were ghosts that appeared only long enough to intercept a woman on a ledge. The Devil's Throat remains a site of morbid curiosity for hikers who visit the red rocks to see where the trail simply stops. The twist in the case does not arrive until 1980, when a group of geological surveyors is exploring a vertical shaft in a remote part of the canyon. They find the remains of a young woman at the bottom of a hole that is physically impossible to reach on foot alone. The site is located miles away from the Devil's Throat, separated by a series of high ridges and deep canyons that would take a professional climber days to navigate. The discovery reinterprets the disappearance as a transport rather than a simple accident on the trail. The final verdict on the death of Leslie Gordon is officially listed as an unsolved homicide by the authorities in Salta. No suspect was ever identified, and the dark sedan was never found in the years of investigation that followed the find. The case remains a staple of local lore, a story of a woman who was lifted from a cliffside and carried into the earth. Her family in the United States was finally able to bring her remains home, but the truth of what happened on that Tuesday morning stayed in the canyon. Leslie Gordon was a nurse who spent her life saving others, only to find herself in a place where no one could save her. The silver whistle she wore was never found, leaving a silence in the mountains that is deep and permanent. Her camera was returned to her parents, a small piece of plastic that holds the only proof she ever reached the top of the ridge. The final photo shows her smiling at a world that was already preparing to close around her. The red rocks of Salta are still there, standing tall and indifferent to the people who walk among them. The dust still moves in the wind, covering the tracks of the dark sedan and the footprints of the woman who vanished. Some places on Earth are too vertical and too open to keep a secret. Yet the Devil's Throat has kept this one for 50 years. The high-altitude sun still glares off the sandstone, blinding anyone who tries to look too closely at the past. The silence of the Argentine canyons is a vast and empty thing, but it is a different kind of quiet than the one found in the heart of a crowded city. In Tokyo, the rhythm of the subway is a constant, a mechanical pulse that masks the stillness of a man who has chosen to vanish in plain sight. There, among thousands of commuters, a silent passenger is waiting for the end of the line. October 31st, 1977. On the platform of Shinjuku Station in Tokyo, a man in a dark charcoal suit is standing perfectly still among the thousands of commuters rushing toward the Chuo line. He is in his late 40s and carries a leather briefcase that looks heavy with the weight of a long day. The air is cool and smells of damp concrete and the faint ozone scent of the electric trains. He moves with the crowd as the silver doors of the train slide open with a rhythmic hiss. He finds an empty seat in the corner of the car, away from the sliding doors and the draft of the platform. He sits down and places his briefcase neatly on his lap, his hands resting flat on the smooth leather surface. The train is packed with people standing shoulder to shoulder, but no one acknowledges the man in the corner. The man is dressed in the uniform of a mid-level salaryman, wearing a crisp white shirt and a wool tie in a conservative shade of navy. He possesses the quiet, unremarkable appearance of someone who has spent decades following the same schedule. He has a routine of taking the evening train back toward the suburbs, a journey that usually takes 45 minutes. He watches the reflection of the cabin in the dark glass of the window as the train pulls away from the station. He has a near-future expectation of a quiet evening in a small apartment, with a warm meal and the news on the radio. He carries a silver fountain pen in his breast pocket, a tool he has used to sign thousands of documents over the course of his career. He is a man who values the invisible nature of his social role, fitting perfectly into the gears of the city without causing a friction. He touches the edge of his briefcase one last time before closing his eyes for a short nap. The train moves through the urban landscape, the rhythmic clack of the tracks providing a hypnotic background to the white noise of the crowd. The man does not move when the train lurches around a sharp bend or when a group of loud students boards at the next stop. He remains perfectly upright, his head tilted slightly toward the window as if he is studying the passing lights of the city. This is his everyday reality, a life defined by the silent proximity of thousands of strangers. The first strange detail appears as the train reaches the halfway point of the line. A young woman sitting next to the man accidentally bumps his shoulder when she reaches into her bag for a book. The man does not flinch or adjust his position, remaining as rigid as a statue in the corner of the seat. The woman mumbles a quick apology in Japanese, but she receives no response from the man in the charcoal suit. She notices that his skin has a strange, waxy quality in the harsh fluorescent light of the cabin. She assumes he is simply exhausted from a long shift and has fallen into a deep, heavy sleep. She returns to her book, but she finds herself glancing at the man's hands every few minutes. They are still resting perfectly flat on the briefcase, but they have taken on a pale, bluish tint that does not match the warmth of the room. The train continues toward the end of the line, and the crowd begins to thin out at every suburban station. The woman next to the man stands up to leave at the third-to-last stop, brushing against his arm one more time. She feels a sudden, sharp chill through the fabric of her coat, a coldness that feels far deeper than the autumn air outside. She walks quickly toward the doors, her heart beating with a sudden, unexplained rhythm. As the train pulls into the final station of the Chuo line, the conductor makes an announcement over the speakers. The last few passengers gather their belongings and step out onto the quiet platform, leaving the cars empty and silent. The man in the corner does not move, his eyes still closed and his briefcase still resting on his lap. The ordinary logic of a commuter waking up at their stop has completely failed. The immersion of the moment locks the scene into the quiet, metal box of the train car. The rhythmic humming of the electric motors is replaced by the hollow, metallic ticking of the cooling brakes. The pressure of the silence in the empty station is like a weight on the ears, making every small sound feel amplified. The man thinks to himself that the city is a very easy place to be forgotten if you simply stop moving. The doors of the train remain open for several minutes as the cleaning crew prepares to board for the nightly sweep. A young cleaner named Kenji enters the car and begins to move from seat to seat, picking up discarded newspapers and empty bottles. He reaches the corner where the man is sitting and pauses, expecting the passenger to realize he is at the end of the line. Kenji reaches out and gently taps the man on the shoulder to wake him. The man's body does not shift or protest. It simply tips forward until his forehead rests against the back of the seat in front of him. His briefcase slides off his lap and hits the floor with a heavy, hollow thud that echoes through the empty car. Kenji lets out a sharp gasp and pulls his hand back, realizing that the man's skin is as cold as the metal frame of the seat. The cleaner runs toward the platform to find the station master and the local police. The investigation into the silent passenger begins as a routine matter of a natural death in a public place. The police examine the man's body and find no signs of violence, no struggle, and no indication of a medical emergency. He appears to have passed away peacefully while sitting in his seat, likely several hours before the train reached the final stop. The voice of the inspector is calm as he orders the body to be transported to the morgue for a standard identification. However, the reconstruction of the man's identity quickly hits a wall that the police cannot climb. They open the leather briefcase and find it is completely empty, containing no papers, no keys, and no personal effects. They check the man's pockets and find that his wallet is missing, along with any form of identification or money. It is as if the man boarded the train with the intention of being found as a total void. The forensic team begins a meticulous examination of the man's clothing, looking for a dry cleaner's mark or a manufacturer's tag. They discover a detail that shifts the case from a tragedy to a chilling mystery of intentional erasure. Every single label has been removed from the man's suit, his shirt, his tie, and even his underwear. The tags were not simply torn off. They were cut out with a razor or a sharp pair of scissors with professional precision. The police realize that this level of anonymity is not a coincidence or the result of a robbery. It is a signature of someone who possessed a deep knowledge of how to vanish from the social record. They check the missing persons reports for the entire Tokyo metropolitan area, but no one matches the description of the man in the charcoal suit. He is a ghost who sat in plain sight for hours, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses who saw nothing. The voice of the investigation turns toward the possibility of Cold War espionage or a highly organized suicide. The detail of the removed labels is a characteristic often associated with intelligence operatives who are trained to be untraceable if they are captured or killed. The man's posture and his clean, groomed appearance suggest he was someone who valued discipline until the very last second of his life. He chose the most crowded line in the city to perform his final act of isolation. The twist in the case occurs when the toxicology report arrives from the medical examiner's office. They find no traces of poison, no drugs, and no common chemicals that would explain a sudden death in a healthy man. They do find a microscopic puncture wound behind the man's left ear, hidden by the hair and the fold of his collar. The wound is so small that it would have been invisible to a casual observer, suggesting a highly specialized delivery of an untraceable substance. The climax of the mystery is the realization that the man was likely murdered while the train was in motion. The killer would have had to stand over him in a crowded car, deliver the fatal strike, and then sit next to him for several stops to ensure he did not move. They would have had to remove the man's identification and wallet right in front of dozens of commuters who were looking at their newspapers or the floor. The invisibility of the crowd was the killer's greatest weapon. The final verdict on the silent passenger remains a permanent status of unidentified and unsolved. The man was buried in a nameless grave in a suburban cemetery. His identity a total cipher that the city of Tokyo could not solve. No family ever came forward, and no one ever reported a missing salaryman who failed to come home on Halloween night. He became a piece of urban lore, a story told by train conductors to new recruits about the man who is still riding the line. The aftershock of the case led to an increase in security cameras and nightly sweeps of the Chuo Line cars. But the mystery of who the man was and why he was erased remains tucked away in a police file that has not been opened in decades. The leather briefcase was kept as evidence for a long time before being destroyed, as it held no clues to the man's past. The silver fountain pen was the only personal item found, but it carried no engravings and no fingerprints. Today, Thousands of salarymen sit in the same corner seats on the Chuo line. Heading home after a long day of work, they look at their reflections in the dark glass and adjust their ties, fitting perfectly into the rhythm of the city. Most of them do not know about the man who sat there in 1977 and never got off. The city is a place that values the routine, and sometimes the routine is the only thing that remains after a person is gone. The final drop of the story is found in the logs of the Shinjuku station from that evening. They show that a man matching the description was seen entering the gates at exactly 5 o'clock. But he never used his ticket to exit. He simply became part of the transit system. A silent passenger who paid his fare and then vanished into the silence of the tracks. The rhythmic clack of the train is the only sound that remembers his journey. It is September 12, 1977, on the Milli Milli Sheep Station in the remote Murchison region of Western Australia. A station hand named David is walking out of a corrugated iron hut, squinting against the early morning glare of the sun. He is 30 years old and has spent most of his adult life working on these massive, isolated properties. The air is already dry and carries the sharp, metallic scent of heated iron and the faint, sweet smell of dry mulga wood. David is a man of few words and steady movements, someone who is comfortable with the immense scale of the Australian outback. He spends his days checking fences, moving livestock, and ensuring the critical water bores are functioning in the heat. He wears a faded denim shirt and heavy work boots that have been stained a permanent shade of rust by the local soil. The station around him is a vast, flat expanse of red earth and low scrub that seems to go on forever in every direction. He has a routine of checking the primary water bore every Tuesday morning, a 3-kilometer walk from the main camp. He carries a small adjustable wrench and a canteen of lukewarm water, tools that are as much a part of him as his own hands. David is a man who values the predictable nature of his chores, finding a quiet pride in the simple maintenance of the station. He knows every rock and every stand of saltbush along the path, navigating the featureless landscape with an internal compass. He lives under the everyday gravity of a life that is defined by physical labor and extreme isolation. He has a near-future plan to visit his sister in Perth for the Christmas holidays, a trip he has been saving for since the previous winter. He carries a small, smooth stone in his pocket that he picked up from a dry creek bed years ago, a detail that serves as a tactile anchor during the long hours of solitude. He is a man who expects the desert to be harsh, but he has never known it to be anything other than honest. David reaches the edge of the camp and begins the trek toward the water bore, his boots leaving deep, rhythmic imprints in the soft red dust. The silence of the morning is absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath his feet and the occasional whistle of the wind through the scrub. He does not look back at the station buildings, moving with a focused intent that suggests he has a long list of tasks to complete before noon. The ordinary life of a station hand is unfolding exactly as it should, one step at a time. The first strange detail appears when David reaches the halfway point of his journey near a cluster of dead gum trees. He notices that the birds, which are usually noisy and active at this hour, have gone completely silent, as if a predator is nearby. He stops and scans the horizon, looking for the movement of a dingo or a rogue bull. But the plains are empty and still. The air feels suddenly heavy and stagnant, as if the oxygen has been pulled out of the space around him. He tells himself it is just a shift in the weather, or perhaps a heat haze starting early in the day. He takes a long drink from his canteen and continues walking. But he notices that the ground beneath his feet is beginning to feel different. The sand, which is usually firm and packed, feels unnaturally soft and light, as if it has been recently sifted by a machine. He looks back at his own tracks and sees that they are becoming shallower with every step he takes. David tries to rationalize the sensation, thinking that he might be entering a patch of fine silt or a hidden drainage area. He assumes the bore is just over the next low rise and that he will find a logical explanation for the change in the soil once he arrives. But as he moves further into the scrub, the landmarks he knows so well begin to look distorted and unfamiliar. The ordinary logic of the trail is starting to break away, leaving him in a landscape that feels like a fading memory. He reaches a small, circular clearing that is perfectly flat and devoid of any vegetation or rocks. The pressure in his ears begins to build, a low humming sound that vibrates through the bones of his skull. He realizes that he is standing in the center of a space that feels completely disconnected from the rest of the station. There is no clear path forward and no obvious way to return to the camp without losing his direction in the shimmering heat. The immersion of the moment locks David into the crushing heat of the clearing. He can feel the burning sensation of the sun on the back of his neck and the grit of the red dust in the corners of his eyes. The pressure of the silence is so intense that he can hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of his own heart. He thinks to himself that his mother's kitchen in Perth always smelled like fresh yeast and vanilla on Sunday afternoons. He does not make it to the water bore that morning. When David fails to return for the midday meal, the station owner grows concerned and calls for the other hands to begin a search. They find his tracks leading away from the hut, the deep imprints in the red dust clearly visible in the bright sunlight. They follow the trail for 2 kilometers, moving with a cautious speed through the mulga scrub and across the dry plains. The investigation into the disappearance of the station hand is a reconstruction of a trail that defies every rule of the outback. The search party is led by an indigenous tracker who has worked the Murchison region for 40 years. He studies the footprints with a clinical focus, noting that David's stride was steady and purposeful for the majority of the walk. But as the tracker reaches the small clearing, he stops and holds up a hand for the rest of the men to wait. He finds that the tracks reach the center of the flat clearing and then simply cease to exist. There are no signs of a struggle, no dragging marks, and no evidence that David turned around or knelt down. The ground is soft enough that even a small animal would have left a mark. Yet the footprints stop, as if the person making them was lifted directly into the sky. The tracker circles the area for hours, looking for any sign of a vehicle or a return trail, but he finds nothing but empty sand. For several days, a massive aerial and ground search is conducted over the Milli station and the surrounding properties. They use heat-seeking cameras and low-flying planes to comb the desert, but they find no body, no clothing, and no remains of any kind. The lack of tree cover in the area means that even a brightly colored shirt should have been visible from miles away. David has vanished from a flat surface in the middle of a clear day, leaving behind a puzzle that the police cannot solve. The voice of the investigation turns cold as the leads dry up and the trackers admit they have never seen anything like it. They look into David's history, searching for a motive for a disappearance or a reason he might have staged his own exit. They find that he was a reliable employee with no debts, no enemies, and a clear plan for his upcoming holiday. The physical impossibility of the scene suggests an external force that leaves no physical evidence behind on the ground. The mystery of the Milli tracks reinterprets the nature of the outback for the residents of the Murchison. It is no longer just a place of heat and isolation, but a place where the rules of physics seem to have a breaking point. Some locals talk about dust devils that can lift a man, while others whisper about older, more terrifying legends of the land. But the facts of the case remain as stark and unmoving as the sandstone ridges of the nearby range. The twist in the search comes when a secondary team finds David's canteen sitting on a rock 10 kilometers away from where his tracks ended. It is upright and still half full of water. Sitting in a location that experts claim a man on foot could not have reached in the time between his disappearance and the search, the canteen was not dropped in a panic. It was placed there with the same precision David used for every other chore. This detail changes the meaning of the event, from a missing person to a transport that covers distances in seconds. The final verdict on the disappearance of the station hand is officially listed as an unsolved case by the Western Australian Police. David was never seen again, and no remains were ever recovered from the red dust of the Milli station. His name remains on the missing persons register, a cold file in a drawer that has seen no new evidence in nearly 50 years. He is a man who walked out of his hut and into a mystery that the desert refuses to give up. The station owner eventually closed the hut and moved the water bore to a different location. unable to look at the clearing without a sense of deep unease. The red dust eventually covered the final footprints, erasing the only proof that David was ever there that morning. The outback remains a vast, silent witness to a story that has no ending and no witnesses. Some tracks lead to a destination, and some tracks lead to a void that the world was never meant to fill. David was a man who lived a life of order, and his disappearance was the only chaotic thing he ever did. The silver wrench he carried was never found, leaving the water boar as the only monument to his final morning of work. The smooth stone he kept in his pocket for luck stayed with him, wherever he ended up. The desert is the only thing that knows if he went up or down, and it is not telling anyone. The silence of the Milli clearing is permanent and heavy, a weight that sits on the heart of anyone who visits that patch of ground. It is a reminder that we are only ever a few steps away from a reality we do not understand. The red dust of Western Australia is still moving in the wind, covering the scars of the past with a layer of heat and time. The journey of the station hand ended in the middle of a stride, and the world just kept turning. The story of the station hand in the red dust usually ends right there in that clearing. But the silence that followed those missing tracks is not limited to the Australian outback. It is a specific kind of quiet that settles in whenever a person simply stops existing without a reason. You can feel it in the air of a room when the television is turned off and the house begins to settle for the night. It is the sound of a story that has no final page and a record that skips and then goes still. We spend our lives building routines and keeping schedules, believing that the world is a place of logic and predictable outcomes. We assume that if we walk out of a door, there will always be a path that leads us back to where we started. But these 13 stories suggest that the ground is much thinner than we admit. Think about the objects we saw today that outlived the people who owned them. There was a silver fountain pen in a pocket in Tokyo and a pair of patterned silk neckties in a cold Canadian river. There was a small gold ring hidden under a glove in Norway and a black camera sitting on a ledge in Argentina. These are small and unremarkable things that were once part of a living person with a name and a future. Now they sit in evidence lockers or at the bottom of a lake holding on to the last heat of a life that was interrupted. They are the only witnesses that remain when the voices have gone silent and the tracks have been covered by the wind. They do not tell us why the tragedy happened, but they remind us that it was real. They prove that a person was standing in that spot and that they had a reason to be there. We often look at these cases from the outside, protected by the distance of time and geography. We treat them like puzzles to be solved or riddles to be debated over a cup of coffee. But for the families who stayed behind, the mystery is not a hobby. It is a physical weight that sits at their dinner table every night. It is the sound of a phone that never rings and a door that never opens for them again. They live in the gaps between what is known and what can never be explained. They spend years looking at old photographs, trying to find a clue in the background or a shadow that they missed the first time. They wonder if there was a single moment when they could have changed the outcome by saying one different word. The silence for them is not a lack of noise, but a presence that has its own heavy and cold pulse. Perhaps the lesson is not found in the crime itself, but in the way we choose to look at the world afterward. We can choose to be afraid of the shadows, or we can choose to value the light while we still have it. The people in these stories did not know they were walking into a mystery. They were just living their lives and making plans for a tomorrow that never arrived for them on that specific day. It is a quiet reminder to appreciate the ordinary weight of a key in your pocket or the sound of a car idling in the driveway. These are the sounds of a life that is still moving and a story that is still being written in the present tense. We should not take the routine for granted because the routine is the very thing that protects us from the void. It is the fence that keeps the red dust away. We remember the smell of the pine air fresheners in the Hamburg attic and the way they tried to cover a truth that could not be hidden. It was a small and artificial scent that became a landmark for a tragedy. We think about the white kitchen cabinets in South Africa where a message was written in red paint that no one could ever decipher. These are the small details that stick in the mind. There was a theater in Lagos where the screen was bright and the row was silent while the world around them kept moving. We think about the farmer in Canada who pulled a bundle from the river and found a woman who had been a name on a business card in Tennessee. These people were connected by nothing but the fact that they were in the wrong place at the exact wrong time for a reason we cannot see. We think about the boy who traveled 800 kilometers in a single night and left his shoe behind as the only proof he was ever there. He looked like he was just stepping out of his own front door, even though he was a world away from his family. These are the impossible facts that make the silence feel so heavy in the room tonight. They challenge our understanding of how the world is supposed to work. There was a woman in Italy who celebrated her graduation and then vanished into a concrete hole only a few miles from her home. We think about the students in India who used their art to create a masterpiece of violence in the middle of a sleeping city. These stories remind us that the most dangerous things are often the ones that look exactly like the life we are living right now in this room. The silent passenger in Tokyo sat in a crowded car for hours, and no one noticed that he was no longer there. We think about the spy in the Norwegian woods who removed every label from her clothes so she could be forgotten by history. These are stories of people who were erased by choice or by force, leaving behind a void that the world cannot fill. They are ghosts that still ride the lines. We think about the nurse in Argentina who stood on a ledge and smiled for a photo while the shadows were already closing in. Her camera was the only thing that made it back to her parents, and it held the only proof of her final seconds of peace. These are the small and precise moments that define a life before it becomes a case file. They are the moments we should hold on to with both of our hands. The 13 stories we covered today are not just accounts of what went wrong, but are reminders of what we still have. We have a name and a place and a routine that still holds together under the weight of the day. We have people who know our faces and who would notice if our tracks simply stopped in the dust. That is a kind of wealth that does not show up on a bank statement or a property deed. I want to thank you for spending this time with me and for listening to these accounts with respect. It is a heavy thing to hold these stories in your mind, and I appreciate your willingness to look at the darker corners of our history. If the tone of these stories felt right to you tonight, you are welcome to join us again by subscribing to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts on these cases. The room is very still now, and the house has finished its nightly settling. The background sounds are fading away, leaving only the echo of the names we mentioned today. I hope you find a sense of peace in your own surroundings and that your path always leads you back home. There is a specific kind of safety in knowing where you are and who is waiting for you there for the rest of the night. I will leave you now with the quiet of your own space. Take a breath and listen to the silence for a moment before you move on to the next part of your night. There is nothing left to explain and no more questions that need to be answered right now. The stories have landed, and they will stay where they belong. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next episode when we find another set of tracks. The red dust of the outback and the salt air of the coast are far away, but the feeling they left behind is right here. It is the feeling of a light that was turned off too early and a conversation that was never finished. We carry that feeling with us as we move back into our own lives and our own routines. It makes the world feel a little more fragile and a little more precious at the same time. We think about the woman in the refrigerator and the professional knots that held her in the dark for 50 years. She was a daughter and a sister who was finally brought home to Tennessee because a scientist found a single piece of hair. It is a small and precise victory for the truth in a world that often prefers to stay silent. It is a sign that the story is never truly over until it is told. There is a sense of gravity in a house that has seen a mystery and a sense of stillness in a person who has survived one. We are all moving through a landscape that has its own hidden fissures and its own sudden drops. But as long as we keep moving and keep talking, we are pushing back against the shadows. We are keeping the clearing from becoming too quiet for the people who are still walking the trail. I will turn the lights down now and let the rest of the night take over. The names of Peter and Jewel and Leslie are still in the air, and they will stay there until the sun comes up tomorrow. They are part of the history of the places they loved and the history of the people who never stopped looking for them. We are just the temporary keepers of their stories for a few hours on a Tuesday night. Take one last look at the room around you and the small objects that make up your own life. The keys on the table and the shoes by the door are the anchors of your own ordinary world. They are the things that tell the world who you are and where you belong. They are the details that matter the most when everything else is stripped away. Do not forget to value them before the house goes dark. The final image I want to leave you with is not a crime scene or a missing person. It is the image of a clear and open path that leads directly to a warm house with the lights on. It is the sound of a door opening and a familiar voice calling out your name. That is the only ending that truly matters in a world full of mysteries. It is the ending that we all deserve at the end of the night. The silence is deep and permanent now, and the stories have reached their conclusion. I hope you find the rest you need, and that your dreams are far away from the red dust and the cold rivers. Thank you for being here with me in the dark, and for listening to the things that no one else wanted to hear. We are done for now, and the rest of the night belongs entirely to the quiet of your room.